Few women in history would leave such an indelible impression as the formidable Catherine de' Medici. Ruthless and intelligent, Catherine would hold the power behind the French throne through the reign of her 3 sons, and has been blamed for many of the worst decisions during that time. But is this a fair assessment of her? Catherine, born Caterina Maria Romula de' Medici on the 13th of April 1519 in Florence, was the only child of Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, the ruler of Florence, and his wife Madeleine de la Tour d'Auberg, who was the Countess of Boulogne in her own right. Both of her parents were said to be as happy at her birth as though Catherine had been a boy. But sadly, they both wouldn't live to see their daughter grow into the woman she would become. Madeleine died just a few weeks after her daughter's birth on the 28th of April. Some said it was a fever from giving birth, others from her husband, a known philanderer, giving her syphilis. Lorenzo himself died shortly afterwards on the 4th of May, apparently worn out from a lifetime of excess and hard living. This meant Catherine was instead raised by her paternal grandmother, Alfonsina Orsini, in her early years. It was a tumultuous time to be born, and proof of the shifting political stability of Catherine's era can be seen in the strong defensive walls of her family home, the Palazzo Medici, the outer protection hiding the luxurious palace within. Pope Leo X, then head of the Catholic Church and uncle to Lorenzo, also took control over Catherine's affairs. The French king, Francis I, wanted the young girl to be raised at his court, but Leo refused, seeing far more power in keeping her within Italy. He instead made her Duchess of Urbino, planning to marry her off to the illegitimate son of the Duke of Nemours, and set them both up as the rulers of Florence under his control. However, Catherine's grandmother died in 1520, leaving her to now be raised by her aunt Clarice de' Medici, and a year later in 1521, Leo died, leaving the young girl without papal assistance. Leo's successor, Adrian of Utrecht, handed the Duchy of Urbino back to the family that was meant to hold it. However, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, an illegitimate cousin of Leo, was voted in as Pope in 1523 as Clement VII, once again giving a helping hand to the 4-year-old girl's future. With her family's large inheritance, even just with her mother's properties alone, Catherine was a valuable marriage pawn. Clement ensured she lived in great style with a large household, but the expenditure for this didn't please everyone. Leo had embezzled huge sums of money from the Florentine coffers, and yet somehow he had kept everyone happy with him due to his charm. Clement didn't have the same ability, and this wasn't helped by Lutheranism taking a stronger hold in parts of Europe, and Francis I and Charles V were at each other's throats. In 1527, violence spilled over in Florence by a group opposed to both Clement and the regime of the man he had left in charge in Florence, Cardinal Silvio Passerini. While Passerini escaped, the mob were reluctant to let their hostage, in the form of Catherine, slip through their fingers. But it was arranged that she should be snuck out and sent to the Santa Lucia convent in the Via San Gallo, before being moved instead to the Santa Caterina of Siena. This was visited by the French ambassador, and he was so shocked by the living conditions there that the little girl was once again moved, this time to the Santa Maria Annunziata delle Murate. On the 7th of December 1527, she was heavily veiled up to be disguised, and taken to the convent in the dead of night. Catherine would spend the next 3 years deprived of freedom behind the convent's walls, but equally protected by them, and apparently her time there was happy. By October 1529, Clement had been forced to crown Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor in order to have his help in freeing the city of Florence, and Charles's troops attacked. The rebel leaders, growing desperate, began to have some very bad ideas about what to do to turn the tables in their favour. They first suggested storming the convent, grabbing Catherine and dangling her naked in a basket over the city walls in the hope she might be hit by fire from Charles's troops. Then there were equally dark suggestions she should be deposited in the local military brothel in order to ensure she was no longer pure enough for any advantageous marriage. At this time, Catherine was just 11. Thankfully, neither of these things happened, as rescue was sent in the form of Silvestro Aldobrandini and his men, who snatched Catherine from the convent. Against her will, as she had shaved her head and taken a veil in order to be kept safe, and at first she refused to leave the convent, and they took her back to the St. Lucia convent. Catherine would never forget Aldobrandini's service to her or the kindness of the nuns at Murate, and she would show both of them favour after she was finally free. Finally, on the 12th of August 1530, the rebels surrendered, and Catherine was taken from her convent to Rome, where she was greeted by Clement apparently with tears in his eyes. Talk of marriage once again came up, and as the Pope was now in a stronger position than he had been previously, Catherine had some glittering offers thrown her way. Candidates included the illegitimate son of Henry VIII, Henry Fitzroy, James V of Scotland, and the Prince of Orange, Philibert of Chalon. Charles V favoured Francesco II Sforza, Duke of Milan, and unfortunately for Catherine, Clement couldn't afford to entirely ignore the Holy Roman Emperor. However, he also didn't actually want to help Charles out in any way with his plan, as he worried it would put him too much in the Emperor's debt, and he didn't want to provoke anything, as technically Clement had never been officially ordained into the church. However, there was a glimmer of hope in the form of Francis I, who decided to focus his ambitions on Italy once again, and having a pope as an ally was a good first move. In 1531, Henri, Duke of Orleans, the French king's second son, was suggested as a potential husband for Catherine. The match was agreed upon, and Catherine stayed with Clement despite the initial agreement stating she would go to live at the French court until she was old enough to consummate the marriage. The Pope, probably quite correctly, assumed that sending Catherine to the French court would create issues with Charles V and kept her by his side as security instead. She was promised a large dowry as well as keeping the inheritance from her mother, and it seemed that Catherine would have a very comfortable life ahead. Henry was not expected to become king as a spare, but he was a catch for Catherine, who despite being wealthy from her family long being merchants, didn't have a drop of royal blood in her veins. Catherine travelled to France with a multitude of jewels, gem-encrusted belts and pearls, a collection that was considered unbelievable compared to what other brides had brought with them. On the 23rd of October, Catherine entered Marseille officially, riding a horse in a gold and silver dress, flanked by a royal and papal guard and a coach draped in black velvet. She impressed her soon-to-be father-in-law by humbly kissing the feet of Clement, who had travelled with her, and Francis lifted her to her feet before kissing her. Henry was somewhat less welcoming, instead being awkward and quiet, although at his father's behest he joined in with dancing and jousting. A few days later, the young couple were married in the Église Saint-Ferréol-les-Augustins church in Marseille on the 28th of October 1533. Afterwards came a great feast, which turned into something of an orgy of debauchery and immoral behaviour shortly after the two 14-year-olds were escorted to their wedding bed. Francis himself was said to have remained in the bedroom until the deed was consummated, and he declared that each had shown valour in the joust. A review from your dad on your wedding night must have been slightly uncomfortable even then. Pope Clement thankfully satisfied himself with waiting to bless the couple in the morning, although he was happy to find them both still in bed together. Catherine saw little of her husband during their first year of marriage, but she spent plenty of time with his sisters, Marguerite and Madeleine, and the three women also shared a household. Catherine made a place for herself at court as the new Duchess of Orleans, and the ladies of the court were impressed with her sharp wit and quick intelligence. However, on the 25th of September 1534, the following year, the death of her uncle Clement meant her standing at court faltered. With his death went many of the promises he had made for territorial gains for France, mostly because the next pope, Paul III, felt he had no obligation whatsoever to keep up those promises, or to pay the rest of Catherine's enormous dowry. Francis was in despair, but there was little to do about it. Despite the fact that this made many at court somewhat annoyed that a different bride hadn't been chosen, Catherine was smart enough to figure out who she needed to get on side to keep her place, starting with the king. She didn't have beauty on her side, but Catherine won her father-in-law over by being lively, enjoying dancing and hunting enthusiastically, bringing out his protective side towards her. But there was still one area in which Catherine failed, and this was in the fact she didn't get pregnant for the first 10 years of her marriage. This was probably not helped by her new husband not taking much interest in her sexually, and by his interest in a woman who would become his favourite, Diane de Poitiers. She had been placed in Henry's household in 1531 to help with his etiquette, but he had easily been charmed by the elegant woman who was 19 years older than him. At this point, nothing untoward happened, although Henry favoured Diane over his wife almost from the onset. In 1537, there came a further shock when it was revealed that Henry had fathered a child with a courtesan named Philippa Ducci, who he publicly acknowledged as his own. This put even more pressure on Catherine to produce a child. To make things worse, in 1538, when Henry returned from war at 19 years old, the 38-year-old Diane shifted from platonic tutor to ardent lover, and the two began an affair. Catherine knew her days as queen were numbered if she didn't hurry up and produce an heir, as there was already a secretive plan in place to have her removed and replaced with Louise of Guise. The Duchess went through a series of strange fertility treatments, from drinking mule's urine to a poultice of cow dung and stag's antlers to be placed on her lady parts. In desperation, Catherine asked for holes to be bored into her chamber floor in order to look down and see what her husband got up to with Diane. While she understandably couldn't stand to look for more than a few minutes, it was enough to convince her that when she slept with Henry, something was very different in the way they did it. A physician was called for who apparently figured out there was something unusual in the reproductive organs of both Catherine and Henry. He gave them a solution, which annoyingly, we don't know. But whatever it was, it worked perfectly. In the summer of 1543, Catherine finally became pregnant with her first child, a boy born on the 19th of January 1544, named Francis after the king. And he wouldn't be the last. Catherine would go on to have 10 children altogether, 7 of whom survived infancy. Funnily enough, Diane never saw Catherine as a threat and encouraged Henry to have more children with his wife. In fact, if Catherine had hoped she would win back a prominent place by her husband's side through having his children, she was sadly mistaken, as Diane was then also entrusted with the care of the royal children. However, the Dauphine's reputation amongst the French people enjoyed a boost with her newfound motherhood, but her husband never visited her bedroom again. On the 31st of March 1547, King Francis died, leaving Henry as king, as his elder brother Francis had passed away in 1536. Catherine was now Queen Consort of France, but her husband still didn't allow her any real power of her own, instead handing the tasks of patronage and favours to his mistress Diane. During his reign, however, many members of Catherine's family were raised to good positions at court, and as she became queen, she found her entourage grew, especially with those who were closer to her homeland, such as the Florentines. Henry's reign also saw the rise of the Guise family through Charles de Lorraine, who would become a powerful cardinal, and Francois de Lorraine, who had been Henry's friend since they were boys, and who now became the Duke of Guise. They had further royal connections as their sister Mary of Guise married James V of Scotland and was the mother of Mary, Queen of Scots. At just 5 years old, little Mary's hand was promised in marriage to the Dauphin Francis, and she travelled to the French court, where she would be brought up alongside Catherine's children. Catherine's efforts with her own children were made more difficult by Diane's presence as well. Henry was warm and affectionate with his children, and certainly part of the public respect he gave his queen was part of this, but Catherine wasn't naturally maternal. Her children certainly respected her and wanted to please her, but she couldn't hope to win their affection while Diane was around. And, to add insult to injury, the king's mistress used the same nicknames for the children that Catherine used. But this wasn't the only area in which Catherine's growing steely confidence could be used, and she was brutal with her ladies-in-waiting if they failed to show discretion at court the way Diane did. Once finding one of her young ladies laid in bed with her lover as well as being pregnant, Catherine, funnily enough along with Diane, had the girl dragged before the king and sent from court. However, in later years, Catherine's resolute attitude towards this would change as she needed the seductive powers of her ladies for political ends, as pointed out by historian Leonie Frieda. But by 1559, things were in for a big change. The Italian War of 1551 to 1559 had kicked off with Henry declaring war against Charles V, with the intention of securing parts of Italy for France and dominating Europe against the Habsburgs. The campaign had mixed results for France, both losing and gaining territories, as the improvement of military technology and professional soldiers meant that all sides, as England also got involved, struggled against the others. However, on the 2nd of April, Henry and Elizabeth I of England signed the first Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, and the second one was signed the following day on the 3rd by Henry and Philip II of Spain. This not only concluded the wars, but the end of the Habsburg-Valois conflict as well. This treaty was also sealed with the betrothal of Catherine and Henry's daughter Elizabeth, who was then 13, to Philip II of Spain. A proxy wedding was held in Paris on the 22nd of June 1559, and as part of the celebrations, a jousting tournament was held. This tournament would prove to be a fatal one for Henry. Apparently, the night before, Catherine had an uneasy night's sleep with dreams of Henry lying unconscious with a bleeding face. The king had been ill for a few weeks before, suffering from vertigo and what was probably stress. Nevertheless, he took part in the jousting, dressed in Diane's colours of black and white, and he defeated the first two challengers. However, Gabriel, the Comte de Montgomery, knocked the 40-year-old king half out of his saddle. Henry insisted on riding again, and this time Montgomery's lance smashed into Henry's face, wounding him fatally. The king was hurriedly moved to the Château de Tournelle and had 5 splinters removed from the wound, including one which had managed to go through his eye and into his brain. Catherine remained by her husband's side, finally taking precedence over Diane, who kept away for fear of the Queen's anger. Henry drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes even able to dictate letters, but finally gave in to his wounds on the 10th of July. Catherine now understood that despite how unfaithful her husband had been to her during their marriage, in order to cement the legacy of their children, she needed to preserve Henry's memory. Diane vanished from Paris, aware that her days were now numbered, and Catherine would instead take on mourning black in Henry's memory, as well as a broken lance becoming her emblem. While Diane would return the many jewels Henry had given her over the years, along with an inventory, Catherine coolly ignored her opportunity for revenge. Instead, Francis sent a letter, no doubt dictated by his mother, in which he admonished Diane for her evil influence with the king, but said he would forgive her. The warning was to remain from the French court. Tradition dictated that the queen should remain with the body of the king for some time, but Catherine's ambition for her children and herself was far bigger than concerns for Henry's spiritual end. Young Francis II, as he had now become, and his wife Mary were in the grasp of the Guises, who quickly moved themselves to the Louvre with the couple in a coup d'etat, and Catherine ensured that she left with them to remain with her son. She was flooded with letters from royalty across Europe, and one of these was from the hand of Elizabeth I. Despite their differences, Catherine had a lot of respect for the English Queen, and in replying to Elizabeth's letter of condolence, she referred to her as our true friend, good sister and cousin. Catherine was deeply in genuine mourning for her husband, although how much of this was reality and how much was a calculated show of emotion designed to paint her as the good wife is anyone's guess. This also allowed the Guises to take centre stage for any mistakes they would make. She was well aware that the problems Henry had left behind would soon grow bigger, and this would make the Guise brothers very unpopular. She could see that her son, who was often ill, was not likely to have the fortitude to stand up to the grown men now swarming around his throne like vultures, and Catherine placed herself firmly in there instead. She was able to lend her legitimacy as Dowager Queen to the Guises regime, and in turn, she was supported in her grief by Mary, who would remain with her mother-in-law and help with speaking to those who gave their condolences. But Francis came to the throne as a young boy with adults fighting for his power, and his father had left the country in a vast amount of debt thanks to his wars. While Catherine supposedly shouldn't have had a place on the council, she nevertheless held secret meetings with the Guises, and her son's official acts all began with words to the effect of it being to the pleasure of the Queen, his mother, and that it was done with her goodwill. But this was also the beginning of turbulent religious wars for France. The Guise brothers began their vehement attack on Protestants, but Catherine took a much more moderate stance and spoke against their persecution. Within her social circle, there were Protestants, and many Catholics thought there should be a way to deal with reformers that did not shed blood. Where she could, Catherine stepped in to help those who were persecuted, but also asked that they didn't hold assemblies and kept their religion a secret behind closed doors. She made it very clear her position on helping the reformers came from a place of wanting to avoid deaths and war, not from agreeing over what the true religion should be. A lot has also been written over the centuries about Catherine's supposed rivalry with her daughter-in-law Mary. One source even suggesting she was considering poisoning her own son in order to be rid of her, which makes no sense when she could just poison Mary anyway. In fact, while Catherine wished to maintain her hold on her son in regard to power and political rule, she was kind and considerate to Mary while she was married to Francis, who was not an easy teenager to live with. His infirmities meant he was often in a bad mood and he was apt to lash out at those around him. The two women shared a lot of time together at chapel and during meal times, and often when Francis disappeared on a hunting trip. Francis's health began to worsen around 1559, and he had dizzy spells that grew more frequent. His skin became blotchy and his face swelled. In the autumn, he fell ill with a severe abscess in his ear, and his wife Mary also suffered from some minor ailments that concluded in a phantom pregnancy. Those at court began to doubt the strength of there ever being an heir to the throne while Francis sat on it. The Bourbon family used this to their advantage when the Protestants looked for a leader, and they first looked to Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre, and eventually to his brother Louis de Bourbon, Prince of Condé, who backed a plan to overthrow the Guises and remove them from their place of power. The Guises moved the entire court to the heavily fortified Chateau of Amboise in March 1560 when they caught wind of the plot. The rebels surrounding the chateau were surprised by the Guises' troops, and many were killed or captured, although many were also small groups of confused people who weren't actually sure why they needed to separate the king from the Guises. Catherine could see that the winds of change were blowing against the Guises, and when in June 1560 Michel de l'Hôpital was appointed Chancellor of France, she set out to work closely with him. He was a French lawyer who advocated working with the French constitutional bodies, and both he and Catherine agreed that the Protestants within France who did not directly pick up a weapon and attack should be left in peace to worship in their own homes in their own way. Both of them put this proposal forward at the 1560 Assembly of Notables held at Fontainebleau, but everything bubbled over into violence in the autumn of that year, when Protestant forces, including those led by Louis de Bourbon, attacked towns in the south and southwest of France. When Catherine discovered this, she ordered the prince to court, where he was instantly arrested. Although the Guises would have been happy to see him dead, Catherine knew that this would kill off any chance at a peaceful resolution, and France already felt as though it was on the brink of civil war. She needed to keep the Count of Condé alive while also securing her family. But matters would move a little out of her hands. On the 9th of November, Francis had a fainting fit, and a week later, the abscess in his ear returned once again, and this time, combined with all of his other ailments, the young man was in agony and slowly dying. Catherine must have been desperate not to believe her eldest son was dying, but she also needed to secure the throne for her next child. The reality was that Charles, her next child, was only 10, and would therefore require a regent for the beginning of his reign. However, the Estates General were more likely to decide on a Bourbon regency, which would give Catherine far less power than she had previously enjoyed. She made a secret pact with Antoine de Bourbon that if he agreed to give up his right to the regency, she would have his brother Louis released. He did agree, and when on the 5th of December the young French king died, Catherine was instead voted in as regent for Charles. She now had huge powers at her disposal and far more hold over the country than she had while working with the Guises. Young Charles became Charles of France, and Catherine kept him close to her side, even choosing to sleep in his chamber with him. She created symbols of her new office, both to try and pull France back into a single unit and to establish her de facto rule as a legitimate one. What made this even more difficult was the fact that many parts of France were loyal to the nobles there before they were loyal to the crown. Catherine now presided over the king's council, and no letters were signed or sent by Charles without his mother first reading them. She was energetic in her role and was described as always talking of business in some fashion, as well as being serious and regal when the situation required, while maintaining a hearty sense of humour. However, some areas were more difficult for Catherine to understand in context, one of those being the religious differences in France. She was moderate in her approach, and she attempted to bring together the church leaders from both sides. However, the resulting Colloquy of Poissy, a conference in which they tried to reconcile the Protestants and Catholics of their country, ended in failure when they failed to reach a resolution, and it dissolved itself without permission on the 13th of October 1561. Catherine had assumed simply getting them to agree on the important matters would work, when in fact their religious devotion on both sides held them back. In January 1562, attempting to bridge the divide once more, Catherine issued the Edict of Saint-Germain to help Huguenots, a series of tolerant legislation that allowed them more freedoms. But the rest of the courtiers were not necessarily on the same page as Catherine and Charles, and in March of that year the Duke of Guise, Francois, committed what would become known as the Massacre of Vassy. The Guise family had tried to prevent the spread of Protestantism in their estates near Vassy, and on the 1st of March Francois headed towards a Huguenot meeting house in the centre of town. Those within were meeting for mass, around 500 or so people. Guise tried to get into the barn, but the worshippers within stopped him, and the Duke lashed out, killing those closest to him. His men then joined in, and a massacre went on for an hour, leaving 50 dead and many injured, including a child. This incident would kick off 30 years of a civil war in France known as the Wars of Religion. Louis de Bourbon and Admiral Gaspard de Coligny raised an army of around 1,000 men, taking towns across France. Catherine took charge and actually met with Coligny in Toury on the 9th of June, although the talks came to nothing. Both sides appealed for support outside their country, and the Protestant forces appealed to Queen Elizabeth of England. With Mary of Scots now on the Scottish throne, Elizabeth didn't want the Guises to gain any further power near her own country, and she offered aid in the form of being a mediator for both sides, but eventually she would tip towards giving further help. Rouen was fought over, and Catherine insisted on visiting the battlefield herself despite the dangers. The war wouldn't end until the 19th of March 1563 with the Edict of Amboise, just about a month after Francois died from a shot in his back. Catherine then rallied both Catholic and Protestant forces to recover Les Havres in Normandy from the English. On the 17th of August that year, young Charles was declared officially old enough to rule without a regent, but he showed little interest in the job, and Catherine remained in the same position of power she had before. From January 1564 to May 1565, Catherine, Charles, and the entire court went on a royal progress around France to inspire loyalty and ensure the Edict of Amboise was being adhered to. The French queen held talks with Jeanne d'Albret, the Queen of Navarre, although Jeanne wasn't happy with these talks. She wrote to her son that Catherine mocked her during these discussions, and afterwards would apparently tell others the opposite of what Jeanne had said. Catherine also met with her daughter Elizabeth, who was still married to Philip II of Spain, at Bayonne near the Spanish border. While there were lavish festivities planned and it was treated as a grand occasion, it was fraught with family tension. The Spanish king excused himself from the occasion, sending instead the Duke of Alba to admonish Catherine over the Edict of Amboise, declaring that she should instead be coming down harder on the Protestants in her country. However, Catherine's efforts with the Protestants would end abruptly with the surprise of Meaux, a failed coup featuring a group of aristocratic Huguenots who tried to seize the king while he was staying nearby. The court fled to Paris, and yet again war broke out across France on the religious divide. This wouldn't end until the 23rd of March 1568 with the Peace of Longjumeau signed by both Charles and Catherine, although this was only an official end, and the bloodshed continued in reality. Threatening the life of her son was something that triggered Catherine, and from this point onwards she followed through on a policy of total repression, praising the efforts of Spain in murdering Protestants by the thousands. Jean III of Navarre retreated with her eldest son to the fortification of La Rochelle, along with other Protestants, and Catherine called her decision to rebel shameless for the threat it made to the Valois dynasty. The wars dragged on again until the Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye was signed on the 8th of August 1570, although this edict was purely based on the fact the royal treasury was becoming depleted, and as a result the Huguenots received more concessions than they ever had before. But Catherine was now increasingly aware of how much more she needed to stabilise her dynasty, and the easiest way to achieve this was through marriages. Charles married Elizabeth of Austria on the 26th of November 1570 in Mézières. Catherine had been eyeing up Elizabeth's older sister Anna, but she was promised to Philip II after Catherine's daughter Elizabeth had died in childbirth. But Catherine also saw the value in bringing together the Catholic and Protestant sides of the French royal family by seeking a match between Jean of Navarre's son, Henri III, and her youngest daughter, Margaret of Valois. Eventually, Jeanne agreed after pressure was put on her on the provision that Henri could remain a Huguenot. When Jeanne came to Paris to buy clothes for the upcoming wedding, she died suddenly on the 9th of June 1572, and accusations flew almost immediately of Catherine murdering her with poisoned gloves. However, Jeanne's autopsy proved she had died of natural causes, but this didn't quell the rumours. However, the wedding still took place about a month later on the 18th of August 1572 at Notre Dame, and tension ran high throughout the city. This coincided with a series of bad harvests and tax rises which didn't help, and on top of this, Catherine had not obtained permission from the Pope for the marriage. There was also a story that when Margaret of Valois was asked if she agreed that Henri should become her husband, she stubbornly remained silent. Her brother Charles got up, pushed her head forward to nod assent, and sat back down. 3 days later, one of the leaders of the Huguenot cause, Admiral Coligny, initially survived an assassination attempt. He had been admitted to the King's Council in September 1571, and many Catholic courtiers took issue with this. A gun was fired from a house going through his hand and arm, and he was taken to his lodgings at the Hôtel de Béthysy, where a surgeon removed a bullet and a finger. Apparently, Catherine was told the news and reacted with no emotion, which was unsurprising considering she was known to be enemies with Coligny. What was surprising was Catherine making a tearful visit to see him, swearing blind she would find his attacker. Cynics of the time suggested she was behind the attack in the first place, although Catherine wasn't the only suspect. She made use of this, leaning on the whispers it could have been the Guises once more, and both she and Charles made much of targeting Villemur, a teacher for their family, possibly in order to throw suspicion if they really were the guilty party. However, Catherine's reaction could also easily have been that of a poker face, wishing to reveal nothing, as Charles's reaction was suitably upset when he was told during a tennis match, throwing down his racket and screaming, "Am I never to be left in peace?" Catherine was eating dinner shortly after this, and a group of Protestants burst in demanding justice. Coligny's brother responded by camping a 4,000-strong army outside the walls of Paris, doing nothing to defuse the position. Catherine first spoke with her advisors on the situation before meeting with the king on the 23rd of August. No details of the meeting survive, but the king is said to have cried, "Then kill them all! Kill them all!" And Catherine is said to have been part of this decision. They would later say they feared a Protestant uprising, and there may well have been some truth to this. But what came next was far from a reasonable response. They decided to attack first, targeting known Huguenot leaders, including Coligny, who was murdered in his bed. On the 24th of August 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre took place in Paris. This was a targeted massacre against French Protestant Huguenots, assassinating them at will. Protestants fell in their thousands around the city, and while estimates of the numbers killed go as high as 30,000, at least 5,000 men, women, and children lost their lives purely for their religion in just 3 days. The most horrifying part of the massacre is that the murderers made a game out of much of it, stopping to drink at taverns and joke with their fellow killers, convinced they were carrying out God's plan through the request of their king. It lasted almost a week, although the violence carried on throughout France well into the autumn. Catherine's thoughts were mostly of how to keep Charles on his throne, although later pro-Huguenot writers would present her as a scheming Italian who had rid herself of all their enemies in one go. An incident which did not help this view was when Henry of Navarre, in order to understandably avoid being killed, converted to Catholicism. During the service, the normally stoic Catherine lost her composure and laughed. Perhaps it was nervous laughter, or perhaps it was to point out the principles of Henri being swept aside so easily in order to save himself. Charles's health slowly deteriorated from this point onwards, not just physically but also mentally. His moods would swing wildly from one moment boasting about how the massacre had gone, to other times declaring he could hear the screams of those killed ringing in his ears. His relationship with his mother began to break down, and he would blame her for the ills within his kingdom, also declaring he should never have listened to her counsel. By the spring of 1574, he also showed signs of tuberculosis and suffered hemorrhaging and bloody coughing. Charles's suffering ended on the 30th of May 1574, aged just 23. Catherine sat by his side and held his hand in deep grief as she wept, but again she had ensured the stability of the French throne first. The day before, she had been confirmed as regent while Charles's younger brother Henri was away, as he had been voted as king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Just 3 months later, Henri returned to France to take up his crown. Unlike his brothers, he came to the throne as a grown man, although he also showed little aptitude for political affairs. He was known for preferring to immerse himself in acts of piety such as pilgrimages than in running the country, and Henri leaned heavily on his mother and his advisors. She did get him to cut down his council to just 8 plus the princes of the blood, and to read all dispatches himself instead of leaving it to his secretaries. Catherine herself was still a charming figure who could draw in anyone with her regal presence, despite her age of 55 and her figure that showed how much she loved rich foods. She was still excited by innovation as she had been in her youth, and Catherine is credited with popularising an early form of underpants in France, as well as the folding fan and handkerchiefs. Although Catherine would have hoped to use Henri's new position to create another useful political alliance, he thwarted her plans by choosing a bride of his own. Just 2 days after his coronation on the 13th of February 1575, he married Louise de Lorraine-Vaudemont, daughter of the Duke of Mercœur. However, there were already rumours that Henri was unable to father children, and as their marriage went on, it would indeed produce no heirs to the throne. Another problem was that the country was deeply crippled by debt, and Catherine wanted Henri to settle the issue. But he was content to leave the decisions to his mother and enjoy himself with his entourage instead. However, his job was made more difficult by his younger brother Francis, Duke of Alençon, who exploited the existing divide between the Protestants and Catholics. Catherine tried to keep her youngest son in line, but a lot of the choices he made appear to have been little thought out. As his elder brother's marriage continued without children, as heir to the throne, Francis played more and more on the anarchy within the kingdom. In 1576, Alençon sided with the Protestant princes, compounded by the fact Henri of Navarre had escaped Paris for his own lands, and would shortly after repudiate the Catholic faith. Seeing that once again war was on the horizon, Catherine begged her son Henri to settle the matter peacefully, and his sister Margaret, who had been left behind when her husband fled to Navarre, feared for her life from her brother's wrath, and posted guards outside her bedroom doors. Family feuds were spilling into politics. On the 6th of May 1576, in order to prevent more bloodshed, yet another treaty was signed by Henri, this time the Edict of Beaulieu. Apparently, Henri wept as he signed it alongside his mother, cursing her for forcing him into this position, and his brother for what he had done as well. The terms of the edict allowed huge concessions towards the Huguenots and required huge finances. But worse than this, it was nicknamed the Peace of Monsieur after Francis, as everyone thought he had forced it on the crown. Catherine and Henri's relationship suffered as a result, and she no longer had the control over the king she once had. Unable to control her son Henri as she had her other boys, Catherine had to settle for being his chief diplomat, using her skills where they were most needed. In 1578, at the age of 59, considered advanced in years for the time, Catherine set off to pacify the south of France and bring it back into the fold. She met personally with the Protestant leaders in each town and city, and her efforts won her renewed respect from the French people. But it wasn't long before Francis made things even worse. The people in the Low Counties, under the yoke of the Spanish Habsburgs, asked him to be their hereditary leader of the United Provinces. Francis decided to take control of several Flemish cities, starting with Antwerp, and led his army there on the 18th of January 1583. The city militia descended on his men, however, and he barely escaped with his life. Catherine wrote to him, berating him for his actions, and the fragile engagement he had held with Elizabeth I was broken off by the English Queen. But Catherine could not remain angry with her youngest son for long. In July 1583, he was suffering from ill health, and Catherine went to help him and speak with him about tempering his ambitions. By December, she herself fell ill and returned to Paris, but she didn't realise how bad Francis was, as by then he had begun coughing up blood. On the 12th of February, he returned to Paris and saw his mother, even though she was ill in bed with a fever, and said he wished to reconcile with his brother. Catherine reportedly wept with joy at the sight, but just a few months later, Francis was sick with consumption. The Queen Mother raced to be at his side, but she listened to his doctors who assured her he was improving. Shortly after she left, she received the news that her youngest son had died on the 10th of June, 1584. In a letter, her grief was evident as she wrote, "I am so wretched to live long enough to see so many people die before me." Things weren't going much better for Catherine with her other children, especially Margaret of Valois. Sick of Henry of Navarre closing himself off from her and his many affairs, Margaret returned to the French court without him in 1582. Catherine arranged for her to return to her husband, but in 1585 Margaret once again fled Navarre. This was bad from a dynastic angle. With Francis now dead and still no children from Henri's marriage, it appeared the next king would be Henry of Navarre. The only way to keep the throne within the family was for Margaret to have a child with her husband who would one day inherit the throne. However, Margaret went to her property at Agen and wrote to her mother for money. Catherine did initially send a little money, but before long she heard that Margaret had taken a lover, and she begged Henry of Navarre to do something about it. In a true double standard of the time, Henry could have as many lovers as he wanted, but Margaret, wanting the affection she had been denied by her mother and husband, resulted in her being branded a harlot, bringing shame on the family. Her husband responded by locking her up in the Château d'Auxonne in October 1586, executing her lover, and Catherine wrote her daughter out of her will. She never saw her again. The death of the heir to the throne in 1584 and Catherine's insistence on trying to appease the Huguenots meant that many aristocratic Catholics formed leagues in their lands. The new Duke of Guise, Henry, son of Francois, took on the leadership of the Catholic League. By 1585, the French king had no choice but to go to war with both the Protestants in his kingdom and the Catholic League, and as his resources ran out, Henri was forced to give in to the Catholic League's demands. He withdrew to fast and pray, otherwise known as leaving his mother to clean up the mess. There is a story that when she met with the Duke of Guise in Épernay that year to negotiate, he was taken aback by her kindness as she asked him to take his boots off and eat something before talking with her. Certainly, she still knew how to charm when needed. By 1588, Henry decided to protect himself with Swiss troops, but the Parisians took affront to this and claimed the right to protect themselves, setting up barricades and refusing to take orders from anyone but the Duke of Guise. Catherine was upset by this turn of events, but seeing that fleeing was the better part of survival in this case, advised her son to leave the city and find a compromise again. But on the 8th of September at Blois, when a meeting of the Estates General should have gone ahead, Henri dismissed them all. Catherine was ill in bed with a lung infection and had no way of knowing this, but her power effectively ended in this moment. On the 23rd of December 1588, he asked the Duke of Guise to visit him, and as soon as the Duke entered the king's chambers, he was stabbed by the king's guards and died at the foot of his bed. The next day, 8 more members of the Guise family were rounded up and hacked to death. It wouldn't be long before Catherine herself was no longer around to give any advice to her son. When Henri told her what he had done, She was apparently distraught, but she was already ill. By early January, she was in bed with pleurisy, and on the 5th of January 1589, Catherine finally died at the age of 69. Because Paris was held by enemies of the crown at the time of her death, Catherine's body was first hurriedly placed in Blois Cathedral. 8 months later, Henri III of France was stabbed to death, and the Valois dynasty came to an end. Years later, Diane de France, an illegitimate daughter of Henry II, had Catherine's remains transferred to Saint-Denis, but in 1793 a revolutionary mob tossed the Queen's bones into a mass grave. Catherine was one of the most political, intelligent and complicated queens of her time. She was a loyal wife who stuck by her husband even when he had a mistress who took over the court, and when he died, she was left in an impossible political meltdown with several children too young to rule alone. Her upbringing, single-mindedness and fears of not maintaining her children's dynasty meant that Catherine could be flexible when needed to secure their throne, but also cold-hearted if any of her children stepped out of where she deemed they should be. She has been blamed for many of the decisions made during the reign of her 3 sons, and while there is an argument to be made that Catherine made a lot of emotional decisions, she was also placed into a difficult religious and political divide throughout France. Across Europe at that time, great change was happening with religion as Protestantism crashed through the old systems of Catholicism, and all leaders were left with the question of how to handle this new faith. Catherine initially tried to find compromise where she could. We would argue she didn't really try to find an equal compromise, but she did work within the limits of her time. But ultimately, her true feelings lay with the safety of her family. When that was threatened, her reaction changed entirely. The political landscape was spread not only across religious lines, but also those of the royal family. What started out as a conflict based in societal change became a way to exploit the anarchy within the family itself. Although this didn't usually work out, as with the example of Francis, the Duke of Alençon. Catherine was not a maternal, warm person, nor was she the cold-hearted poisoner of myth. Catherine was instead a woman who had the intelligence and drive to take power, saw how to do it while remaining true to the patriarchal systems of her time, and she genuinely had a desire to see France flourish again. She was a powerful woman who used her charm and wit to make friends, but her sharpness also made her many enemies. Ultimately, Catherine was a woman who was concerned for her children's future, like many parents, but within the bloodthirsty framework of 16th century politics and royal dynasties. She was blamed for poisoning her daughter-in-law. She was accused of corrupting her son, controlling her husband, ruining the Polish nobility, and dragging Italian intrigue into a kingdom that supposedly had no need for it. And after surviving the courts of Milan, Naples, Krakow, and Vilnius, she was allegedly murdered by her own trusted servant. Her name was Bona Sforza, and for centuries Polish history treated her as one of its great villains. The story you have probably heard, if you have heard of Bona at all, is that she was a scheming Italian queen who poisoned anyone in her way, introduced dangerous foreign habits, and smothered her son so badly that she helped destroy the Jagiellonian dynasty. But is this the truth? Bona was born on the 2nd of February 1494 at Vigevano near Milan into one of the most powerful families in Italy. Her father was Gian Galeazzo Sforza, the rightful Duke of Milan, and her mother was Isabella of Aragon, daughter of the King of Naples. On paper, Bona was born into extraordinary power. In reality, she was born into a family that had already been politically strangled. Her great-uncle Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, had effectively stolen power from her father. Gian Galeazzo was Duke in name, but Ludovico ruled Milan. Bona was still a baby when her father died in 1494, and inevitably there were rumours that Ludovico had poisoned him. We don't actually know if he did, but this was Renaissance Italy, where he died conveniently was often only one step away from someone helped him along. Either way, Bona's childhood began with a lesson she would never forget. Titles meant very little unless you had the power to defend them. Her mother Isabella fought hard to preserve what remained of her children's inheritance, but the Italian wars tore through the family's hopes. Ludovico fell, the French invaded Milan, Naples was contested, and Bona spent part of her childhood moving between courts and fortresses while the great powers of Europe carved up Italy as though it were a particularly attractive cake. By 1512, Bona was the only surviving child of her parents. Her siblings were dead, her Milanese inheritance was gone, and all that remained to her was her mother's southern Italian territory of Bari and Rossano, and Isabella's determination that her daughter would still matter. And Bona was educated to matter. At Bari, she received the kind of Renaissance education that made her far more than a decorative marriage prize. She studied Latin, history, law, theology, geography, music, mathematics, and classical literature. She was taught by humanists, surrounded by Italian court culture, and raised by a mother who had lost almost everything but never surrendered her pride. Bona grew up watching a widowed woman fight diplomats, kings, and emperors for her rights. It is not difficult to see where she learned the habit. The marriage negotiations took years. Bona was no longer the heiress of Milan in any practical sense. But she was still a Sforza, still an Aragonese princess through her mother, and still connected to the tangled politics of Italy. Eventually, the match came from the north. Sigismund I of Poland, known as Sigismund the Old, had been widowed and needed a new queen. He was in his 50s. Bona was 24. She arrived in Poland in 1518 and was crowned queen at Krakow. The contrast must have been enormous. Bona came from the Italian Renaissance, from courts where art, poison, banking, diplomacy, classical learning, and family murder all somehow managed to sit politely at the same dinner table. Poland-Lithuania was powerful, wealthy, and politically sophisticated, but its court culture was different. Bona did not arrive as a shy foreign bride hoping to blend in. She arrived with Italian servants, Italian habits, Italian artists, Italian taste, and the political instincts of someone whose family had been eaten alive by hesitation. At first, she performed the expected role extremely well. She gave birth to children quickly. Isabella in 1519, Sigismund Augustus in 1520, then Sophia, Anna, Catherine, and finally a son who died shortly after birth. In dynastic terms, Bona had done her job. She had provided the Jagiellonian dynasty with a male heir and several daughters who could be used in marriage alliances. Many queens would have stopped there, retreating into piety, household management, and embroidery with suspiciously aggressive symbolism. Bona, of course, did not. She became one of the most politically active queens in 16th century Europe. She sat in council, gave advice, built a faction, promoted her own clients, and involved herself in foreign policy. She understood perfectly that a queen's power rarely came from one official position. It came from access, timing, money, childbirth, patronage, information, and the ability to make people need you. Bona made herself necessary. Her relationship with Sigismund appears to have been functional and politically effective, even if it was not some great romantic epic. He was cautious, slow-moving, and often reluctant to provoke the nobility. Bona was sharper, more aggressive, and far more willing to push. This made her useful, but it also made her enemies. A foreign queen who stayed quiet could be praised for modesty. A foreign queen who actually governed was another matter entirely. And Bona really did govern. She took a deep interest in royal finances and land management, especially in Lithuania. She bought and consolidated estates, reformed administration, increased revenues, and helped strengthen the economic base of the monarchy. In the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, she supported reforms that reorganized landholding and agricultural obligations, part of the wider movement toward what became known as the Volok reform. This was not glamorous work. It was surveys, measurements, rents, duties, accounts, and angry landowners. In other words, actual power. She also changed court culture. Bona has often been credited, somewhat too simply, with introducing vegetables to Poland, especially the group of soup vegetables later associated with Italy. That is probably more legend than clean fact, because obviously no one in Poland had been staring at a cabbage in terror before 1518. But she and her household did influence food, manners, dress, music, art and architecture at court from an Italian background. Under Sigismund and Bona, Krakow became a major Renaissance centre. Italian artists, sculptors and architects found patronage there, and the royal family spent heavily on tapestries, jewels, medallions and building projects. Bona was not the only cause of the Polish Renaissance, but she was one of its most visible engines. But there is the problem. Everything Bona did to strengthen royal power made the nobility more suspicious of her. Poland was not an absolute monarchy. The nobility guarded their privileges jealously, and they did not appreciate an Italian queen buying land, building influence and encouraging stronger central government. By the 1530s, resentment had hardened into open hostility. In 1537, during a military campaign that descended into political confrontation, the nobility rebelled in what became mockingly known as the Chicken War, supposedly because more poultry was eaten than fighting was done. It was ridiculous, but also serious. The nobles were furious about taxation, military obligations, royal policy, and above all the growing influence of Bona and her supporters. Bona's greatest dynastic success also created future disaster. In 1529, her young son Sigismund Augustus was elected king during his father's lifetime, securing the succession. This was a huge achievement. It meant the Jagiellonian line would continue without a contested election after Sigismund the Old died. But it also made the young prince a political prize, and Bona's relationship with him became one of the defining struggles of her later life. At first, she had shaped him carefully. He was her only surviving son, the future of the dynasty, and the centre of her ambitions. But sons, of course, grow up and develop ideas of their own. Sigismund Augustus fell in love with Barbara Radziwiłł, a Lithuanian noblewoman from a powerful family, and secretly married her. For Bona, this was a political nightmare. Barbara brought no major foreign alliance, strengthened the already powerful Radziwiłł family, and threatened everything Bona had tried to build. Bona opposed the marriage furiously. So did much of the Polish nobility, although many of them were happy to blame Bona for the conflict, because apparently everyone could agree that if something was unpleasant, the Italian woman had probably done it. When Barbara was crowned queen in 1550 and then died in 1551, the rumour machine did what it always did when powerful women were nearby. It whispered poison, and Bona was accused of murdering her daughter-in-law. There is no solid evidence she did. Barbara had been ill, possibly with cancer or another wasting disease. But poison accusations were useful. They explained a tragic death, attacked a hated queen mother, and fitted perfectly into the existing stereotype of Bona as an Italian schemer. Italy, in the northern imagination, was practically made of daggers, perfume, and suspiciously effective medicine. Bona did not need to be guilty. She only needed to be plausible to people who already hated her. When Sigismund the Old died in 1548, Bona's position became far more fragile. She was no longer the king's wife, she was the king's mother, and that was powerful but also dangerous. Her son wanted independence. His marriage to Barbara had already opened a wound between them, and although Bona remained wealthy and influential, she could not dominate him as she once had. For a woman who had spent decades building power through the structures of queenship, widowhood changed everything. Eventually, in 1556, Bona left Poland and returned to Bari. This has often been treated as a retreat, the bitter old queen going home after losing control of her son. But that is too simple. Bona still had Italian claims to defend, especially Bari and Rossano, and the Habsburgs were circling. Returning to Italy placed her physically in the lands she meant to protect. It was not just an emotional exit, it was a political move, and she did not return poor. Bona left with enormous wealth accumulated over decades, money, jewels, movable goods, and claims that made her one of the richest women in Europe. Soon after, Philip II of Spain borrowed a vast sum from her, usually known as the Neapolitan sums. The debt would become a long-running financial headache for her descendants, because kings were very good at borrowing money and rather less enthusiastic about giving it back. Then came the end, and it was pure Sforza tragedy. In November 1557, Bona fell ill at Bari. Her trusted courtier, Gian Lorenzo Papacoda, was deeply involved in the events surrounding her final wills. One version of her testament favoured Philip II and Papacoda's interests. Then Bona briefly recovered enough to dictate another will, restoring her son Sigismund Augustus as her main heir. Shortly afterwards, she died. The suspicion was immediate: poison. This time, unlike the accusations against Bona herself, the charge has always seemed much more believable. Papacoda was later rewarded by Philip II, which does not exactly make everyone look innocent. We cannot climb inside the cup and test it ourselves, but the circumstances stink. And not subtly either. Bona was buried in the Basilica of San Nicola in Bari, far from the Polish court she had transformed, and far from the son who had broken from her control. Her daughter Anna later helped create a grand tomb for her, a final attempt to honour a woman whose reputation had already been dragged through several countries. She was not a saint. She was controlling, ambitious, ruthless when needed, and perfectly willing to use money, marriage, and patronage to get her way. She could be overbearing, especially with her son, and her political judgment was not always perfect. But the legend of Bona tells us far more about what people feared than what she actually was. They feared a queen who understood finance. They feared a foreign woman who did not remain decorative. They feared a mother who treated dynastic politics as her own battlefield. They feared someone who arrived from Italy, looked at the machinery of Poland-Lithuania, and immediately began pulling levers that many men thought belonged to them. For centuries, that made her a villain. But Bona Sforza was not the poison in the Jagiellonian court. She was one of its sharpest minds. And in the end, the woman accused of poisoning everyone else may well have been the one who was poisoned herself. Isabella of France would go down in history not as a badly treated queen, a shrewd diplomat, or an intelligent, feisty woman, but as a she-wolf. This insult pushed aside the entire character of the medieval queen and left only a hollow caricature. In reality, only her adultery prevented her from being seen as a liberator of England. This is the real story of one of history's most well-known femme fatales. The exact date of Isabella's birth is uncertain, but based on chroniclers of the time, she was likely born around 1295 in Paris. She had illustrious parentage. Her father was Philip IV, King of France, and her mother was Joan I of Navarre, Queen of Navarre and Countess of Champagne in her own right. Her father Philip, nicknamed the Fair for his tall stature and good looks, was considered a silent, despotic king, once described as not a man or beast, but a statue. He was a feared and respected king who increased the wealth and land of medieval Europe's most powerful country, but was by all accounts devoted to his wife. Her mother Joan was a beloved and efficient queen consort of France, providing her husband with 3 surviving sons and 1 surviving daughter, as well as being demure and respectful in all regards. However, she was also a strong and capable leader of her domains, and repelled attacks not once but twice on her lands, also founding the College of Navarre in Paris. There's little doubt that Isabella would have grown up knowing what was expected of a queen consort, but also what a royal woman was capable of, and possibly the incorrect knowledge that all kings were like her father. Isabella appears to have been given a good education despite being female, and was taught to read. Although there is no evidence she learned to write, she would always have a love of books, and the fact she sent letters suggests she understood writing. Her life was also a privileged one, and she would have grown up with a strong sense of importance as the descendant of kings, queens, and saints. She was betrothed from a very young age, however. Philip wanted only to make France stronger and guard his kingdom against the Flemish. There was a long-standing feud with England over territories that were now under France's crown, and Philip wanted to repair this, as well as prevent Edward I, King of England, from making an alliance with the Flemish. Suggested by the Pope, 2 marriages were agreed. That of Edward I to Philip's sister, Marguerite of France, and of Edward's son, Edward of Carnarvon, to Isabella. While the details of the proposal then dragged on for many years due to Edward I attempting to play for the best political match possible for his son, he finally agreed to the marriage in 1307, shortly before he died on the 7th of July of that year. Now Edward II of England, the new king had showed little interest in his bride, but could not afford to lose Gascony, the territory that would become England's again upon his marriage, especially as he now also faced conflict with Scotland. He sent envoys to France to prepare for the marriage in Boulogne. Like most royal women of the time, Isabella was described in glowing terms for her beauty, but there is no specific description of her, only that she resembled her father more than her mother. This suggests she may have been tall with blonde hair, and this is corroborated by 2 statues in Beverley Minster and Winchelsea Church in Sussex said to be of her, which show a round-faced woman with curly blonde hair and high eyebrows. Unusually for the time, chroniclers also commented on her great intelligence. And perhaps this might have been the start of a great partnership between 2 royals, except that there was a 3rd person in this marriage. When Edward was about 15 years old, his father decided it was time he had some male friends, and one of those who joined his household was Piers Gaveston. Piers was the same age, handsome, had impeccable courtly manners, and had already been part of 2 military campaigns. He was also indiscreet, arrogant, and ambitious. And while he could be accused of sometimes being disrespectful to those above him, he charmed Edward. It was said the prince entered into an enduring compact with him, which has been taken to mean they entered into the medieval practice of blood brotherhood. While 2 young men being so close, especially in an era when men were often away together on military campaigns for long periods of time, wasn't unusual, The relationship between the prince and his new favourite was enough to draw comment. Many chroniclers contemporary to events suggest their relationship was more than mere brotherhood or friends, while some outright remarked Edward wanted to sleep with Piers. However, both men would also go on to marry and father children, and while this could simply be considered their duty, Edward also had at least one child with a mistress. Therefore, while modern historians remain divided on the subject, it seems highly likely from the evidence that exists that Edward and Piers were at minimum in a close friendship to the exclusion of all else, or possibly that they were gay or bisexual. But while in the 14th century anything other than heterosexuality was viewed as a sin worthy of severe and sometimes fatal punishment, it was actually Piers's exclusive access to royal patronage that was so distasteful to the nobles of the court. On the 25th of January 1308, the marriage of Edward and Isabella finally went ahead at the cathedral at Boulogne-sur-Mer. Isabella must have been pleased with her first sight of Edward. He had inherited his father's height at 6 foot and was described as handsome, strong, and had shoulder-length curly fair hair, beard and moustache. He dressed to impress and spoke Norman French as his mother tongue. The importance of their marriage was obvious by the guest list. No less than 8 kings and queens were present. There's no evidence they underwent the traditional bedding ceremony, but this could be as much down to Isabella's young age as to any possible disinterest on the groom's part. During a feast held as part of the 8-day wedding festivities, Philip IV warned Edward against thinking about annulling his marriage as certain persons in England had suggested, meaning Piers, as Gascony was England's only through marriage to Isabella and was destined for the children they would have. Isabella's first sight of England was on the 7th of February, when their ship finally landed at Dover. To everyone's horror, when they stepped onto the dock, Edward ran up to Piers and greeted him in an embarrassing display of affection and kisses, calling him brother, as Isabella and her uncles who had travelled with them looked on in astonishment. Whether or not Isabella knew of the rumours about her husband before her marriage is uncertain, but she would have been greatly offended by Edward showing his favourite more affection than herself. But the insults didn't stop there. Isabella soon found out that the income she expected to live on was non-existent, and there was no treasury money with which to dower her. On top of this, many of the jewels her father had gifted her and Edward with, as well as jewellery Isabella had brought as part of her trousseau, had been given to Piers by the English king. She found out when she saw him wearing some of it. An end was only put to it when she wrote to Philip, putting her fury down onto parchment, and her equally infuriated father demanded his new son-in-law put down in writing what he intended to give Isabella each year to live on. The fury of the nobility against Gaveston would only increase with the coronation of the royal couple. On the 25th of February 1308 at Westminster Abbey, the coronation of Edward II and Isabella of France went ahead, all organised, of course, by the king's favourite. As grand and full of pomp as the ceremony was, the royal couple were not the star attraction. Instead, Piers stole the limelight in what was probably the most insulting way possible. He arrived in a pearl-studded silk robe in imperial purple, a colour usually worn only by the monarch. Added to this, he was carrying St. Edward's crown, a privilege usually for the highest-ranking noble of the kingdom, and Piers had only just been elevated into the peerage. One earl only held himself back from giving Gaveston a beating because he was in front of the Queen and inside a church. It got worse at the coronation feast at Westminster Hall, at which Edward chose to sit with Gaveston rather than his wife, and Piers had also oddly decided to display the king's coat of arms with his own. Isabella's uncles Louis, Count of Evreux, and Charles, Count of Valois, were horrified. They returned to France spitting with fury for their kinswoman, uncertain the rumours about Edward and Pierce were true. The Queen Mother also left court and returned to Marlborough Castle, leaving her niece with no one to ask about aspects of queenship and no one to confide in except her French ladies-in-waiting. At just 12 years old, Isabella would have to rely on her instincts. Edward was not turning out to be the king she had thought he would be either. Unlike other medieval kings, Edward appeared to be disinterested in tournaments and military matters, and enjoyed rustic pursuits such as digging ditches on his estate, thatching, swimming and metalworking. He was also down to earth and made friends easily with common folk from all walks of life, which horrified the nobles and their ideas of social order. He also enjoyed theatrical shows and singing, something which was shocking at the time, but to us seems like Edward was a cultivated man who loved the arts. In short, the king didn't seem to want to be a king at all, but he was also pious, visiting shrines and giving alms generously. He was also a good and loving father to his children that came along later, but none of that made people respect him as a leader. To start with, Isabella was too young to wield any political authority, but as she grew older and wanted her part in politics, Pierce was still in the way. But she had made friends with the barons over the years too, and they were firmly on her side with wanting Gaveston gone. This was, for them, mostly because he was a gatekeeper to royal patronage, accepting bribes and favours when instead the barons should have been able to speak directly with the king. At first, with the support of her father, Isabella covertly lent her support to the enemies of Pierce, but she was wise enough not to publicly show any hatred towards Gaveston, lest it damage the relationship she was attempting to build with her husband. But her father, Philip IV, was all too happy to publicly announce his support for the barons unless Gaveston disappeared from the picture. Edward was left with no choice but to exile his favourite to Ireland in 1308, but as a result he started to show more respect to Isabella. He assigned her lands and more patronage, ensuring she had a proper income, and her father withdrew his support for the barons. For a while, their relationship improved, but by 1309, Gaveston had returned from Ireland. This time, however, Isabella seemed to find a working relationship with him. Perhaps the three of them realised they were stuck being a threesome, and as ignoring Isabella would earn the wrath of her powerful father, it made sense for there to be some way of working together. Isabella also felt she was in a stronger position than she had been, as she built up her own allies at court, primarily in the Beaumont family, originally from France like herself. Edward, however, was losing what little control he had of his barons. This was part of the reason that in 1311, Edward finally was pushed to go to war, this time in what would be a failed campaign against the Scottish. This was partly to appease the barons, and partly to establish a court away from Westminster to make things easier for himself. Isabella travelled north with him, but it was going to be a dangerous trip. The English army was sent to Scotland, but as not many of the barons had decided to support the king, it was a weak army. Robert Bruce had ensured no provisions for them either, by destroying crops in the Scottish borders and moving livestock north, and so faced with starvation, the army moved south again. This was too much for the barons, who rose up against their king, and in June signed the Ordinances of 1311, a series of 41 regulations they imposed upon Edward. Edward was outraged at the amount of limits they wanted to put on his power, but he was most aghast at Ordinance 20, which stated that Piers had to leave the realm forever. On the 16th of August, Edward met his parliament and tried to plead with them. He would follow everything else, provided they allowed Gaveston to stay. The barons were unmoved. Despite the troubles she had with Edward, Isabella chose to stand by his side against the barons. She sent letters to her French uncles asking for their aid against the uprising, as well as a number of letters to her other supporters asking the same. But Edward had no choice but to agree by September the 30th. By the 1st of November, Piers had to leave, and he eventually went on the 3rd. But it was short-lived. Piers had returned by Christmas of 1311 and was reunited with the king in January 1312, probably at Knaresborough. The reason for his return might have been the birth of his daughter Joan, but the king used the opportunity to declare the ordinance against him unlawful and restored all the lands Gaveston had previously had taken away. By March, Piers was shoring up Scarborough Castle in preparation for the battle against the Lords and had been excommunicated. The barons had divided up the realm to oppose Edward and planned to capture Gaveston. Throughout all of this, Isabella stood with her husband, and in so doing, also with Piers. She would have agreed with Edward against the king being stripped of his royal powers above all else, and it's even possible that, having been pushed into his company so often, she found Piers an acceptable companion who was no longer threatening her position as he once had. She even went out of her way in December 1311 to send a gift of luxury foods to Gaveston's wife, Margaret de Clare, when she was pregnant, further proof of Isabella softening towards Piers. Isabella would soon be pregnant herself, the threat of war overshadowing what was otherwise a happy triumph of her queenly duties. In April, when the barons began to move north, Edward and Gaveston fled to Newcastle upon Tyne, leaving Isabella to follow at a slower pace, likely because of her pregnancy. She finally arrived around the 20th of April, but her husband sent her to Tynemouth Priory for safety, a place that would allow Isabella to escape by sea if necessary. However, on the 4th of May, the Earl of Lancaster's army had reached Newcastle, and Edward fled to York to raise support, while he left Gaveston back at Scarborough. They had fled by boat from Tynemouth Priory, and despite a tearful Isabella begging to go with them, Edward had refused. The Earl of Lancaster was her uncle, and there is proof he meant her no harm by way of a secret message which was sent to her assuring her of the same, and merely that they wanted Gaveston gone. But it seems likely that Isabella did not receive the message, as she left the priory in a hurry, leaving many of her possessions behind. By the 16th of May, she had rejoined the king, but it's not hard to imagine she was pretty angry with what had been her near escape, and the fact that the king was happy to leave her and his unborn child behind. Piers did not escape, however, finally being captured after he was stranded at Scarborough Castle. He was taken to Warwick Castle, condemned to death, and on the 19th of June, Guy de Beauchamp and Thomas of Lancaster took him out onto Lancaster's land at Blacklow Hill, where he was run through by two Welshmen. The favourite was dead. When Edward found out about Gaveston's death, his first reaction was anger coupled with grief. He swore bloody vengeance on those who had killed his beloved, and this would overshadow much of his life. But what did Isabella feel? We don't know her actual feelings, but by the 29th of June, she wrote a letter to her husband expressing sympathy and outrage for Pierce's death. It suggests she felt more strongly about the correct order of things than for her husband's favourites, at least for now. But her mind turned to other things, as in the autumn of that year she travelled to Windsor Castle to prepare for the arrival of her first child, and was joined by her aunt, Queen Dowager Marguerite. On the 12th of November, Isabella's labour began, and Edward rushed to Windsor to be present. In the early hours of the morning, on the 13th of November 1312, she gave birth to a much longed for son, who would also be named Edward. Isabella, now 17 years old, was secure in her position as Queen of England and mother to the heir to the throne, and her influence over Edward grew. But scandal was never far behind, and in 1313, Isabella and Edward travelled to France to drum up more support, as well as attend the ceremonial knighting of her brothers. The trip started out pretty well, with feasts and festivities, and Isabella's uncles put on a satirical puppet play for their guests. Afterwards, Isabella handed out silk purses she had made herself to her brothers and to their wives, her sisters-in-law. After returning home to England, Edward and Isabella held a great feast in celebration of their return in June of that year, and this feast included 2 French knights that had travelled back with them. To Isabella's dismay, she saw 2 of the silk purses, those given to her sisters-in-law Blanche and Marguerite, hanging from the belts of the knights. Although these could have been given only as gifts, Isabella seems to have got some evidence of wrongdoing, for on her next visit to her father in 1314, she informed him and suggested it was as the result of an affair the 2 women were having. The result was that both would be thrown into prison for the rest of their lives, and Isabella's reputation in France suffered for it. The Queen of England was starting to show she could be ruthless when she saw what she thought was wrongdoing against her person. Back at home, things got worse. Edward led another disastrous campaign against the Scottish in 1314, resulting in the Battle of Bannockburn in June. It was a turning point for the Scottish forces, and the English barons once again turned on Edward, blaming him for the losses. Isabella, yet again, remained on the side of her husband and stood by him. The most powerful of the nobles, the Earl of Lancaster, despite being her uncle, now saw Isabella as his enemy for this, especially as Isabella continued to grow her relationships with the Beaumonts, who Lancaster hated. He retaliated by ensuring that her income was severely cut, although this was also due to a changed situation in England affecting the economy. There were torrential rains that year that ruined the harvest, and this would continue for a few years, leading to the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. On the 29th of November 1314, Isabella found out the sad news that her father, Philip, had died. Gone with him was also the stable support from France for England. In 1316, Isabella would give birth to her second son, John of Eltham. Unfortunately, not even this happy event could do much to improve the unpopularity of Edward II. Even his affable manner with the common people meant nothing now in the face of civil unrest, failing wars with Scotland, and unstable government. John Daedrus, a royal pretender to the throne, appeared and claimed to be Edward II swapped at birth. For a while, the dislike of the real Edward II led some to believe John, and rumours abounded until his execution. Isabella was deeply upset by these events, and she responded by becoming even closer to the Beaumonts, especially her alliance with Henry de Beaumont. She also increased her role in politics, attending more council meetings and increasing her own land holdings. Her growing importance is clear, as in 1319, the Scottish general Sir James Douglas attempted to capture her at York for Robert Bruce. Once again, Isabella managed to escape in time, but suspicion fell on Lancaster for having helped with the attempted kidnapping. By 1320, Isabella travelled to France with Edward to ask her brother Philip V, now King of France, for help against the barons. By now, Isabella had also given birth in 1318 to her first daughter Eleanor, and would soon have her fourth and final child, Joan, in 1321. However, all this was made worse by the relationships that Edward was building. He had cultivated a growing alliance with the Despensers over the years, and in view of the vacancy Piers had left years before, it was now filled with Hugh Despenser the Younger. He was the same age as Edward, and the same rumours of the two men sharing a bed abounded, just as it had between Edward and Gaveston. The Despensers were rivals of the Earl of Lancaster and his family, but they also, with Edward's blessing, began to increase their power base in Wales along the Marcher lands. This brought them into conflict with Roger Mortimer de Chirk and his nephew, Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, who were to that point the most powerful barons holding English lands in Wales. Where before they had supported Edward, that support now melted away, leaving the king even more isolated at court. For Isabella, she must have been appalled that once again Edward was putting his controversial personal relationships above running the country. And unlike with Piers, the Queen found herself unable to work with Hugh in any way. By 1321, it became clear the Lancastrians could not stand Despenser either, and they demanded Hugh's exile. Isabella was asked to petition the king in order to help prevent another war. She did so, publicly going down on her knees and begging the king to set aside the Despensers in the face of keeping the peace with England's subjects. But in what must have felt like severe déjà vu, Edward refused. Her attempts were praised but had little impact. But an event involving Isabella was about to stir up popular opinion for her husband, provide the Despensers with a way back into court, and start another war. She went on pilgrimage to Canterbury in early October of 1321, but went very far out of her way with a visit to Leeds Castle in Kent. The castle was held by Lord Badlesmere, a steward of the royal household who had recently sided with Edward's enemies, and at the time, he wasn't at the castle, but his wife, Margaret de Clare, was. It's highly possible that Isabella went here on purpose with Edward's knowledge, and when she arrived and asked for shelter, Margaret Badlesmere was alarmed. She insolently refused the Queen entry into the castle, and when Isabella ordered some of her soldiers to force their way in, Margaret retaliated by having archers fire at them, killing 6 soldiers in the process. Isabella withdrew wisely to a nearby priory, but while she had been expecting some stubbornness, she was angered and stunned by the behaviour of Lady Badlesmere. She immediately wrote to Edward, who must have been delighted at the news, as it gave him the excuse he had been looking for. Showing himself infuriated by the behaviour to his beloved consort, the king sent a message to Badlesmere himself. Rather stupidly, Baron Badlesmere sent back a letter agreeing with what his wife had done. Edward declared he would make an example of his steward, and he sent the Earl of Pembroke at the head of his army to Leeds Castle. Roger Mortimer and Humphrey de Bohun rode out to help when Margaret wrote to her husband frantically, knowing she could not withstand a siege. It would be a mistake. Lancaster had never wanted Badlesmere as a steward in the royal household, and so he told the other Marcher lords to stay put, making it clear he was opposed to Mortimer and de Bohun's actions. The king's army surrounded Leeds Castle, and while Edward was away, Isabella was given the Great Seal to protect, and assumed control of the Court of Chancery from the Tower of London. The majority of the earls in England were actually on Edward's side this time, as they perceived his actions, as he wanted them to, as the actions of a king, gaining vengeance for the slight to his queen consort. Leeds Castle fell to the king's forces on the 31st of October 1321, when Lady Badlesmere finally surrendered. She and her children were sent to the Tower, along with her sister and nephew, the first women to be held there in prison, and several of her garrison were hanged. It was the beginning of the Dispenser War, as it was called. No longer would Edward II be viewed as a weak, feeble king, but in fact, he now went the other way, proving that anyone who rebelled against him in any way would lose lives, goods, and even their families. All the rest of Badlesmere's castle surrendered to the king within the month. Isabella was given Leeds Castle and the goods within as compensation for what had happened to her, and she returned the Great Seal to her husband. The events at Leeds Castle seemed to be the first indication of Isabella being more cunning and sinister than before. Perhaps she was innocent of what was going to happen. Perhaps Edward had simply asked her to drop into Leeds Castle out of her way though it was to check on the Badlesmere family. Perhaps she had come up with the plan with her husband. We simply don't know. Knowing he now held the stronger position, Edward decided to push on with his army and deal with Lancaster's forces and the Marcher Lords. Going into Wales first in December, he quickly dealt with Mortimer's army, and the Mortimers submitted to the king shortly afterwards. By January of 1322, some lords had fled north to join Lancaster, but Edward's forces were now bolstered with fresh men from Wales. He went north, meeting the Earl of Lancaster on the 10th of March at Burton-on-Trent, but the Earl fled further northwards without a fight. The king's forces, led by Sir Andrew Harclay, met the Lancastrian army at Boroughbridge, holding the town's bridge over the River Ure. At least one chronicler, Robert of Reading, states that it was Isabella who sent word to Harclay, asking him to move south and hold the bridge. She also had supplies for the king sent to both York and Carlisle. At Boroughbridge, the king's army outnumbered the Earl of Lancaster's 700 men by 4,000, and so the ensuing battle was quick and one-sided. Harclay was given the title of Earl of Carlisle for his capture of Lancaster, who was taken to Pontefract Castle, given a show trial, and summarily executed on the 22nd of March. Edward's main oppositions on all fronts were now gone. Some historians in the past have asserted that throughout this period from autumn of 1321, Isabella became a lover of Roger Mortimer. While this certainly had happened later on, it's doubtful their affair began this early. At this point, Isabella seems to have been supporting her husband's actions fully, against both Lancaster and the Marcher Lords. Mortimer also only appeared at court once, so they would hardly have had time to see each other. And from the time Edward had stormed into their lands, Mortimer had been in trouble. In January 1322, he was forced to submit to the king at Shrewsbury and was thrown into jail in the Tower. His goods and lands were confiscated, and his wife Joan was imprisoned with him. After the execution of Lancaster, Edward exacted bloody punishment on all of Lancaster's followers, beheading and killing many. When Isabella joined her husband at Pontefract Castle in April, she was probably horrified at the bloodbath taking place, and there is evidence she tried to intercede with the king for many of his prisoners. She successfully saved at least one of the barons, Lord Noville, but no others. However, Edward was going to cause another split between himself and his wife. The Despensers, who had fled abroad before the war began, were now invited back by Edward on the 8th of December 1321, under his protection. They had fought by his side over the next few months, with their return made official by the 11th of February. By the time Isabella arrived at Pontefract, Hugh Despenser resented her presence, and seeing how she wanted to save many of the prisoners, instead urged the king on with his tyrannical version of justice. In May 1322, Isabella and Edward travelled to York, where they would meet with the Parliament that would finally find the Earl of Lancaster's ordinances prejudicial to the crown. This would restore Edward's powers to their fullness. But although Isabella had remained steadfast and loyal throughout the campaign, and although she had urged her husband to stand up against Lancaster and his army, she was shocked by Lancaster's death. He was her uncle, and a member of the nobility. His death set a dangerous precedent. And yet it was not the king Isabella blamed, but Hugh Despenser for his encouragement of the punishment. The Queen's hatred of the new favourite of the king would be Edward's undoing. Edward was now in the strongest position he had ever been in as king. He had 4 children, including a healthy son as heir to the throne. He had a supportive queen who was popular and loved by his people, and he had rid himself of any political adversaries who threatened his rule. But his relationship with Hugh Despenser would prove to be a mistake. Isabella had come to England perhaps with romantic notions of her new husband being like her father, and had found Edward wanting. Nevertheless, the French princess had styled herself as a popular English queen, doing her royal duties without complaint and keeping her fury about Piers Gaveston only in private letters. She had found a way to work with her husband's first favourite, despite the strain it must have placed on her marriage, and she had supported his wars. But now, the increased power of the Despensers and the continued tyrannical behaviour of Edward would drive an immovable wedge between Isabella and her husband. This would shatter not only her marriage, but the very peace and stability of England itself, and Isabella would rise briefly as its champion before becoming its most hated woman. We left Isabella in part 1 as a queen standing by her husband despite the damage he had done to their marriage with his personal relationships and the damage his wars had done to the peace and stability of England. But while Isabella had learned much over her queenship, she was about to become the saviour of England, as well as its most hated woman. By 1322, things had changed a lot for Isabella. She had gone from being a young French princess with little political influence, infuriated with her husband Edward II's infatuation with Piers Gaveston, to a queen who was mother to the heir to the throne, a powerful politician in her own right, and a consort willing to stand by her husband through thick and thin. There had been several wars, from conflicts in Scotland to outright civil war in England. But for all the years where the couple had worked well together, Edward's latest relationship was about to tear them apart irrevocably. While Isabella had grown her relationships at court amongst the nobility, most notably with the Beaumont family, Edward had grown closer to the Despensers, especially Hugh Despenser the Younger. Their relationship was so close that just as with Piers Gaveston, rumours abounded that the two men shared a bed. But just as with Piers, there isn't really any evidence that this was the case, and although there were whispers of Edward being attracted to his male favourites even in his own time, it's equally as likely that the two men had sworn to each other as blood brothers. Today, we might call it a bromance. And where Isabella had found a way to work with Piers, she was unable to do the same with Hugh, who resented her presence. She hated Despenser, both for how much he was pushing himself equal to the king and because Isabella blamed him for the death of her uncle Thomas, the Earl of Lancaster. Whether or not Isabella truly cared about her uncle is uncertain, but what is certain is that his death, as a member of the nobility, set a dangerous precedent. But it wasn't just Isabella who disliked the Despensers, and they were about to make themselves even more unpopular. On the 10th of May 1322, the elder Hugh Despenser was made Earl of Winchester, and it signalled the start of 4 years of tyranny. They would control Edward II from that point on to their own ends, and it was made easier by there being very little competition. When Edward had delivered swift retribution to those who stood against him, he had also removed most of the nobility that would have kept the Despensers in check. Removing these noble families and confiscating their properties had made the king very wealthy, and he bestowed many of his new properties on his supporters. However, one person didn't receive anything from Edward: his wife Isabella. She was also disgusted with his form of justice, as it extended to family members, widows and the elderly of the men who had stood against the king. Many of Isabella's friends were affected, and chroniclers also condemned the king's actions. But the reality was that it was Despenser behind much of this. He imprisoned women and children, harassed widows and extorted their money, and even kidnapped a woman for a year until she agreed to hand over £10,000. The result of this was that everyone hated the Despensers even more, and the little bit of popular opinion the king had built up faded away. The one thing the Despensers had in their favour was their ability to raise finances for the king, through fiscal reforms to the royal wardrobe and chancery, as well as creating markets within England for the wool trade so that merchants didn't need to travel abroad. The Despensers despised Isabella as much as she despised them. She had exerted considerable control over Edward for a while, and she was responsible for convincing the king to exile the Despensers. She was the one person standing in the way of the Despenser family's political dominance. In May 1322, Edward announced his intention to launch a fresh campaign against Scotland. By June, when the truce between Scotland and England ended, Robert Bruce began raiding in the English north once more. Edward marched to meet him with his illegitimate son Adam by his side, but just like previous campaigns, his army found no food or supplies. By October, despite the king's optimism that there was still hope for a battle, Edward's men were starving and suffering from that worst of medieval battlefield ills, dysentery. Adam died during this campaign, most likely of dysentery, and his father had to turn back to Yorkshire for men and food. Robert Bruce took the opportunity to press him, coming south and settling at Northallerton by the 12th of October. But where was Isabella? When Edward went to Scotland, he had sent his queen to Tynemouth Priory. It must have been uncomfortable for Isabella, with not too distant memories of when she had fled the same priory years before. And unfortunately for Isabella, history was about to repeat itself. By the 14th of October, Isabella was still at the priory with her ladies-in-waiting, while Edward and the Despensers were staying at Rievaulx Abbey, a few miles east of Northallerton. Isabella felt nervous about her position, and she sent word to her husband that she wanted protection. Edward offered to send Despenser troops, but unsurprisingly, Isabella must have turned this down, as Edward changed his offer in a second letter. He instead sent Henry de Sully, a French knight, remarking that he knew this would be more agreeable than others, indicating the Despensers. When Edward received word that Robert Bruce and his Scottish army were coming towards them, he and the Despensers fled to Bridlington. In doing this, he once again abandoned his wife, very much exposed to kidnapping or attack from the advancing army. Isabella was prevented from moving south thanks to the Scottish army moving forwards, and her escape by sea was difficult because of Flemish ships loyal to Scotland patrolling the area. She also knew it would be next to impossible to withstand a siege. Isabella was instead forced to use the squires within her household, and they bravely tried to reinforce the priory's defences before managing to commandeer a ship to escape south by sea. Fighting broke out as Isabella and her ladies-in-waiting were hurried onto the ship. 2 of her ladies-in-waiting died, one from drowning while out at sea, and another after they disembarked after dodging hostile Flemish ships. This time, after landing safely at Scarborough and preparing to go to York to Edward, Isabella's fury knew no limits. It was the second time her husband had abandoned her at Tynemouth Priory, and once had been too much. She realised that Edward had put both his own safety and that of Hugh above her own, and her immediate response was to blame Despenser. And when the king's messengers arrived to meet her, they informed her that not only had Edward left Revo, but Robert Bruce had swept in and taken everything left there, and then defeated the king's forces at Byland. It snapped the limits of Isabella's patience. When Piers Gaveston had been alive, Isabella had at first been irritated by him, but later found a way to live alongside him and his relationship with Edward. No doubt she recognised Gaveston for what he was, a peacock, merrily strutting alongside the king, a gatekeeper for the king's favour, but not a real political threat. He had got as far as he did because Edward allowed him. Isabella was also younger and less confident back then than she was now. But Hugh Despenser was a different matter. He and his father were hungry for power, sharply politically minded, and it's highly likely Hugh Despenser's interests in Edward were based more in the kingdom than in the king himself. In the 10 years after Pierce's death, Isabella had supported Edward and been the perfect queen consort. But in late 1322, this would change. After Christmas of that year, Edward announced publicly that Isabella was to travel off on a pilgrimage in 1323 around England, by herself. This was effectively the start of Isabella's separation from Edward. There isn't actually any evidence she went on pilgrimage at all, but it suggests Hugh Despenser was whispering in the king's ear and suggesting the queen be elsewhere, now the royal couple had fallen out with one another. In mid-January until the 17th of February, Isabella went to stay in the royal apartments of the Tower with her young son Prince Edward. Things grew worse in February when King Edward launched an attack on Louis de Beaumont, the Bishop of Durham, blaming him for the chaotic escape of Isabella from Tynemouth Priory. The Beaumonts, who had long been friends of the Queen's, now fell out of favour with the King. Isabella's movements after this time go quiet until several months later, although we also know much of her privileges regarding royal patronage were revoked. This was not how a queen should be treated. Hatred against Edward and Despenser grew amongst the general population. The Earl of Lancaster's treason had been forgotten, and all that was remembered was his public intentions of reducing royal oppression and tyranny. Miracles were reported at his tomb, as well as in St. Paul's at a tablet bearing his likeness. Edward tried to stomp this out by removing the tablet and refusing to allow people to visit the tomb. In 1323, 2,000 people were barred from leaving offerings at the tomb, and they attacked the king's guards, killing 2 of them. Public feeling against the weak king and his puppet master Despenser had never run so high. Sir Andrew Harclay, who had been given titles and prizes for his part in the Battle of Boroughbridge, was executed for treason. After it transpired, he had wisely tried to enact a peace treaty with the Scottish. On the 1st of August 1323, something that had only been achieved once before happened. Roger Mortimer escaped the Tower of London. He made his way to France on a ship, continuing to Paris to seek the protection of the French king, Charles IV, Isabella's brother. He was warmly received, something which rankled with Edward back across the Channel. Charles cheerfully announced that he would, of course, expel all English exiles in France, provided Edward expelled all French exiles in England, which would have included Despenser. While there is no evidence for it, it's possible Isabella could have recognised that the only person able to stand against the tyranny of the Despensers was Mortimer, and she may have even recommended him to her brother. Tensions with France grew, and this would have a detrimental effect on Isabella. Edward fell out with Charles and twice postponed paying homage for Gascony. Finally sick of waiting, Charles declared Gascony forfeit in July 1324, sending an army in to take it the following month. By the end of 1324, Despenser and Edward removed Isabella's lands, cut her annual income from 10,000 marks to 1,000 marks, arrested her French attendants, and took over her household. But worse than this, Isabella's youngest children, John, Eleanor, and Joan, were removed from her under the spurious reasoning that being French, she might convince them to commit treason against their father. A common myth about Isabella is that she was not maternal, but there's no evidence for this. In fact, even though, as was practice for the time, her eldest son went to live in his own household at the age of 5, her other children remained with her, suggesting she was very actively involved in their upbringing. Equally, they would remain devoted to their mother for her entire life. Isabella was heartbroken and furious by this point, and she smuggled out letters to her brother Charles complaining about her treatment. The French king was enraged for his sister and sent demands that Edward treat her better, which were ignored. On the 18th of November, Edward announced that the upkeep for the Queen's food and drink would be reduced to 2,920 marks a year, roughly £1 a day, and any French subjects remaining in France would be arrested. Despite the risks, 27 of Isabella's loyal servants and chaplains had stayed with her, and they were shut up in various religious houses across England. Isabella must have been stunned at her husband's vindictiveness. While she had expected such treatment from Despenser, it was still shocking coming from Edward. Isabella had been a loyal and patient wife. She had given her husband 4 healthy children and had stood by him through stupid political decisions, failed battles with Scotland, and even his infatuation with Piers Gaveston. She had done nothing to deserve the treatment she got from her husband. As tensions grew with France and her marriage crumbled into nothing, word came that Mortimer was raising an army in Hainault. The Pope, who had suggested the marriage of Isabella and Edward in the sense of a lasting peace between France and England, suggested Isabella should be sent to smooth relations. An escape route had been opened for her. The king's envoys put pressure on Edward to let her go as well, stating that Charles had agreed that if Prince Edward was made Duke of Aquitaine and he went with his mother to pay homage, the French king would restore all lands taken from the English crown. While some later historians, especially in the Victorian period, would claim all of her actions from this point on were of a harlot queen ready to turn viciously on her rightful husband, it's clear the English queen actually had little choice. To continue as things were would have been to leave her children without a mother, herself without any dignity, and England to the Despensers. It was finally agreed. and Isabella and Prince Edward set off, arriving in Paris in March 1325. A truce with Gascony was quickly agreed upon, and the Queen's 13-year-old son paid homage for the lands England held in France to his uncle in September of that year. However, although she was supposed to go back to England at this point, Isabella refused to do so. Edward was outraged and demanded Isabella return at once, but she retorted that she was afraid that either Despenser would have her killed, or even that Edward himself might order it. Charles IV also replied that his sister had come of her own free will, and that if she wished to remain, she could. She was his sister, and as such, he would not expel her or Prince Edward. He also changed his mind about lands in Aquitaine, refusing to return them, resulting in a temporary arrangement where England held administration of the remaining lands under its claim, but France had the lion's share. Even if someone had agreed with Edward in regards to his wife, no one could deny he was failing politically as a ruler. It was also around this time that Isabella began to surround herself with allies. Many of these were opposed to the Despensers or had been victims of their and the king's rough treatment, and they fled to Paris and flocked to the Queen. It's unlikely Isabella set out for France to set up opposition to Edward, more that she hoped to threaten to leave him from a safe place until he rid himself of Hugh, but nevertheless, she was the natural choice for dissenters. She was joined by the Earl of Richmond as one of her primary supporters, Henry de Beaumont, with whom she had long been friends, and even Edward's own brother, the Earl of Kent. For Isabella herself, she publicly snubbed some of Edward's closest allies and began to dress as a widow, claiming Hugh Despenser had destroyed her marriage. And she still had Prince Edward with her. Not only was keeping him in France a good threat against King Edward, who was fond of his son, but it also allowed Isabella to potentially agree to a marriage of her son to someone who would aid her politically against her husband. Furthermore, it offered another possibility, that of replacing the father with the son altogether. Sometime in 1325, Isabella's cousin, Jeanne, Countess of Hainault, approached her with an offer of marriage between Prince Edward and her own daughter, Philippa of Hainault. It was a good alliance. It meant Isabella could invade England with an army not raised from France, which would win her no favours with the English, and Hainault would be a lucrative trading partner. During this, Jeanne also reintroduced the Queen to Roger Mortimer. Mortimer had been at the Hainault court raising men for an invasion of England with the full support of William I, Count of Hainault. We don't know the circumstances of their actual early meetings, but by December of 1325, Mortimer and Isabella were having a passionate affair. It was said not only that they found each other attractive, but also that they shared an interest in Arthurian legends, fine art, and expensive tastes. However, despite the strength Isabella had shown so far, this was not a partnership of equals. Reportedly, Mortimer dominated Isabella and made most of the decisions, and while this may seem odd, Isabella was possibly more than happy to have a man in a strong position looking out for her interests, even if it was probably mostly because they aligned with his. He may also have exerted a certain amount of sexual control over her, not surprising considering the loveless and sexless marriage she had been in for the past 2 decades. However, in public, the pair gave no indication of their private affair. It was a dangerous choice for Isabella. She lived during a time when adultery was almost the worst sin a wife could commit, and for a queen it was treason. However, perhaps surprisingly, many of those who were her allies turned a blind eye, so long as the alliance served them well. By the summer of 1326, Roger and Isabella took Prince Edward with them and left the French court, travelling to Hainault. There, the betrothal between 13-year-old Philippa and Prince Edward took place, and using the dowry, Isabella was able to build up an army. William, the Count of Hainault, also offered up several ships as part of the marriage agreement. Isabella even got word to the Scottish King, Robert Bruce, who was all too willing to make a mutual agreement against Edward. On the 22nd of September, Isabella, Mortimer, and Prince Edward set sail for England. 2 days later, on the 24th, their ship landed near the mouth of the River Orwell on the east coast of England. They had a small army with them, which most estimates place around 1,500 men, and Isabella quickly moved inland. While her provisions were unpacked, the Queen quickly wrote letters to the citizens of England's towns and cities, explaining she had come to avenge the death of the Earl of Lancaster and to rid the realm of the Crown's enemies, namely the Despensers. She was met cheerfully as she travelled to Bury St Edmunds, then on to what was likely Ipswich. When her soldiers went looking for food and supplies, the local people came to her and complained that their goods had been taken. Isabella asked them what a fair price was and paid them, something which was a good bit of PR for her. Edward issued orders to sheriffs to stop Isabella when he received word on the 27th of the invasion, but they soon switched sides when it became clear how many nobles had mobilised behind the hard-done-by Queen. London became unsafe due to unrest, although most of its citizens were on Isabella's side, and Edward fled towards Wales. By the 7th of October, Isabella and Mortimer had reached the outer walls of the City of London, but by the 9th, Edward was in Gloucester. The Queen swiftly marched west in order to cut him off, but he slipped across the border to Wales before she arrived. The elder Hugh Despenser still held Bristol against Isabella and Mortimer, but they now had a force to be reckoned with, and by the 18th of October, they placed the town and castle under siege. By the 26th of October, it had fallen, and Isabella was also able to be reunited with her daughters Eleanor and Joan. She was overjoyed at seeing them once again, but the occasion wasn't all happy. Isabella had never had a huge issue with the elder Despenser, who, although she knew to be politically ambitious, had shown her no animosity personally. She attempted to protect him from the raging mob, but to no avail. His Lancastrian enemies executed him, rather grimly chopping his body into pieces and feeding it to their dogs. It was a dark cloud that foreshadowed what was to come. Now in a desperate position, Edward, who was now down to a pathetic guard of 12 archers, and Hugh Despenser the Younger, attempted to sail in a small boat to Lundy, an island in the Bristol Channel. The weather was not on their side, however, and they were pushed back to the mainland. Isabella set up her base in Hereford and asked Henry of Lancaster, brother of the late Earl of Lancaster, to find her husband and arrest him. After 2 weeks of evading capture, Edward and Hugh Despenser were finally caught near Llantrisant on the 16th of November. Revenge would be swift. Edmund Fitzalan, one of Edward's closest supporters, and Hugh Despenser the Younger were brought before Isabella. Edmund was sentenced to execution, although this was apparently on the orders of Mortimer. He was beheaded, but some accounts suggest a blunt sword was purposely used in order to require several strokes. Hugh could expect little mercy. Knowing this, he attempted to starve himself before his trial, but with no luck. His trial was a show trial, and Despenser wasn't allowed to speak in his own defence. His gruesome execution included being hung as a thief and drawn and quartered as a traitor, as well as having his entrails removed and burned while he was still alive. On the 24th of November 1326, Despenser was dragged out to an angry mob bent on retribution, who put a crown of nettles on his head and wrote scripture on his skin after stripping him naked. But another terrible punishment awaited the condemned man, that of castration, which can only have been a particular punishment added on by Isabella for the suspected crimes of Hugh sleeping with Edward. We know that Isabella and Mortimer were present as they watched their enemy die a horrific death, but unfortunately, we don't know what the Queen's actual thoughts were. Many myths sprang up in later years that she had eaten a meal while watching, or at least an apple. The truth is we don't know, but no doubt she was relieved at Despenser's death. Now the only problem left was Edward. Lawfully, he was still Isabella's husband and the anointed king, and there was nothing in law that described the process to remove a monarch. But it was clear the English people would no longer put up with Edward as king. As a temporary measure, he was placed into the custody of Henry of Lancaster at Kenilworth Castle, and the king's Great Seal was given to the Queen on the 26th of November. Once this was in her possession, Isabella began using it to create writs in Edward's name. She took the Tower of London under her control and convened a council in Wallingford to discuss what Edward's fate would be. It was decided Edward II would be legally deposed, something that had never happened before, and that his son would take the throne as Edward III. As young Edward was still not an adult, it was also decided that Isabella would be regent, but of course, as she was literally and figuratively in bed with Mortimer, he would also make the decisions. This was hardly a done deal, however, as the legal basis for deposing Edward II was shaky. There was also the delicate matter of whether Isabella, as his legal wife, should go to stay with him in his imprisonment. However uncomfortable a subject this may have been, it was decided that the threats Edward had previously made against Isabella's life meant it was unthinkable that she join him, especially as she also needed to be regent for her young son. These decisions were ratified at the First Parliament without the king on the 7th of January 1327. A deputation of clergy was sent to persuade the king to give up his crown to his son freely, especially as Edward III refused to take the crown without his father's blessing after seeing Isabella weeping at the decision made. Isabella excused the Franciscans from sending one of their order as part of the deputation, as Edward II had always been devoted to their order. This shows that, unlike the hardened woman the Queen is often painted as, she did still care about the feelings of her husband and perhaps felt pity for him, despite all that had happened. For the sake of his son, Edward capitulated the crown of England. The reign of Edward III officially began on the 25th of January 1327, and he was crowned in Westminster a few days later on the 1st of February. The deposed King Edward II was then moved from Kenilworth to Berkeley Castle in the Welsh borders, under the custody of Lord Thomas Berkeley. One of Edward III's first moves was to award his mother an annual income of over £13,000 per year, rather than the £4,400 she had previously been given. While this was a huge sum of money, and would later be used as evidence of Isabella's avarice, it was also about patronage. Her son's new regime was a shaky one, and she would have needed to consolidate both his position and her own by giving favours and extending royal patronage. No doubt, any later greed on her part came from a desire to never again be in the difficult financial position she had been in during her early years as a bride and under the rule of the dispensers. She also purchased and was given several properties and landholdings, making her one of the wealthiest landowners in the kingdom. On the 23rd of September 1327, there came some distressing news. Edward II was dead. All they were told by the messenger was that it was due to a fatal accident. His body was buried at Gloucester Cathedral, and his heart was given to Isabella in a silver casket. However, this was too neat a solution, and so rumours soon began. It was known that plots to free him had sprung up, and there had been 3 failed escape attempts by this time. It is possible that Edward died of ill health due to his treatment. While he was supposed to be looked after to the standard of his birth, and £5 was sent every day for his upkeep, and records at the castle show luxuries bought on his behalf, many chroniclers of the time suggested he hadn't received these goods. But other rumours circulated that he had been murdered. But on whose orders? The third plot to free Edward had been planned by Rhys ap Griffith, a Welsh knight. Word of this got out to several of Mortimer's allies, including William de Shalford, who wrote to him to tell him of the plot. Edward II being free was a threat to Isabella's regime, but it was a far bigger threat to Mortimer and his place behind the English throne. It was later claimed that Mortimer then took William de Shalford's letter to a trusted retainer, telling them to show the letter to the king's jailers and to quickly remedy the situation in order to avoid great peril. This was in early September, and in view of what came a few weeks later, can only be interpreted as orders to quietly murder the king. Roger was in Wales at this time, and Isabella was 130 miles away in London. So if this is what happened, it would appear Isabella had nothing to do with it. Later historians would point the finger of murder at the Queen, but there is actually no evidence pointing to this, and it seems more likely that the hindsight version of her as a fallen woman committing adultery was simply embellished. In fact, despite the accusations of letters and orders, there is no evidence whatsoever of a plot to murder Edward II. A minority of historians suggest Edward may have escaped and made his way to Europe, but again, there is no evidence for this, and it seems the most unlikely outcome. The following year in 1328, on the 24th of January, Edward III married Philippa of Hainault in a lavish ceremony at York Minster. However, while it was normal for the Queen Mother to then give up her dower lands to her new daughter-in-law, this didn't happen. Isabella seems to have been reluctant to give up her position, and Philippa's coronation was postponed. The reasons for this can't be good ones. It's possible Isabella was jealous of Philippa, who was about to have a happy marriage with a youthful husband. The king Isabella was never able to have. She may have been sharing a bed with Mortimer, but as his wife was still alive, she could not marry him or publicly acknowledge him. It's also possible that after being so close to her son, as well as having such control over him as mother and regent, she was jealous of the way the new queen would influence young Edward. Scotland was still an issue. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Isabella was realistic about the war with Scotland, and she knew that she had enough on her plate. A decision was made to find peace with Robert Bruce, and although Edward III initially opposed it, he eventually agreed. But he bitterly declared publicly that the whole thing had been arranged by the Queen Mother and Mortimer. Peace was formally drawn up with the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, bringing an end to the First Scottish War of Independence. Part of the treaty was also that Isabella's daughter, Joan, would marry David Bruce, heir apparent to the Scottish throne. Edward III would renounce any English claim to Scottish lands. The Scottish would send an army against any enemy except the French, and compensation would be given for the border raids to the tune of £20,000. However, those earls who had lost Scottish landholdings were not compensated, and the compensation that was given was taken by Isabella for the treasury. Overall, it was not a popular move. Many nobles became disillusioned with the new regime, including those who had once been close to the Queen, including Henry, Earl of Lancaster, and Henry de Beaumont. In order to help with public opinion, Isabella reformed royal powers of administration and local law enforcement, as well as deciding to pursue her son's claim to the French throne. While this was popular at home, it was understandably not popular with the French nobility, who threw the claims out. By the end of 1328, the country seemed ready to descend once more into civil war. Lancaster mobilised his forces and declared he was against Isabella and Mortimer. Mortimer had irritated much of the nobility by his overuse of power, especially with the fact that Roger had been created Earl of March by the young king. His ennoblement made him insufferable and haughty, and he began to act as though he was a king himself, travelling everywhere with a retinue of 180 men-at-arms and living an expensive lifestyle. In January 1328, Mortimer led an army to Lancaster's stronghold at Leicester, taking it and then marching to Bedford. Edward III rode north to force Lancaster to submit, and surprisingly, so did Isabella. As his allies deserted him, Lancaster must have realised he had little choice but to kneel before Edward and Isabella, and he did so at Bedford. He escaped death as a punishment, but was forfeit to an enormous fine, and Henry de Beaumont fled to France. Around this time, Edward III seems to have started becoming restless of his mother taking over so much control of royal matters, but he especially had an issue with Mortimer. Isabella may have been greedy and overstepped the mark at times, but her son was fond of her, knew she had been through a traumatic life, and she was still a queen. Mortimer, on the other hand, was not royalty yet acted like a king, and it was also obvious that many of Isabella's decisions were at least heavily influenced by her lover. By 1330, Edward III had quietly gathered a loyal body of support from both the church and the nobles. He had also grown increasingly angry at the way his young wife was being sidelined, especially as she was now pregnant, and it was unthinkable that she should give birth without being crowned as queen. Isabella and Mortimer, under pressure from Edward, gave up some of the Queen's dower lands, and arrangements were made for Philippa's coronation. Finally, on the 4th of March 1330, Philippa was crowned as Queen of England. Tensions grew, and by July, Mortimer and Isabella had placed themselves in Nottingham Castle with security, after Roger heard of plots to get rid of him. The young king had had enough, and after being summoned to a meeting with Isabella, Mortimer, and a young nobleman who supported him named William Montagu, when Mortimer declared that the king's word was in opposition to his own, it was to be ignored. Edward decided to act. On the 19th of October, Montagu was charged with leading 23 armed men into the castle by a secret tunnel. Edward knew he was watched by Mortimer's spies, and so remained inside the castle, sneaking downstairs to meet with his men after retiring for the night. They burst into Isabella and Mortimer's chambers, where they were having a meeting with other council members discussing the arrest of Montague, and fighting broke out. Mortimer was overwhelmed, and Isabella apparently, although Edward had remained outside the door and out of sight, cried out, fair son, take pity on gentle Mortimer." She was ignored. Parliament was called the next month, and Mortimer was put on trial for treason, for behaving as a king and ignoring the Regency Council, for questioning the king's word, and worst of all, he was accused of murdering Edward II. Isabella, however, was portrayed as an innocent bystander to proceedings, and no mention was made of her affair with Roger Mortimer. This shows that Edward III, perhaps through a mixture of his fondness for his mother, his pity for all she had previously been through, and his determination to be done with the complicated mess his parents had created, wanted to preserve what was left of her reputation. Mortimer was sentenced to death and was hanged on the 29th of November 1330 at Tyburn, but Edward III showed leniency in not having him drawn and quartered. Edward wasted no time in cementing his authority, and Isabella was sent to Windsor Castle to be put under house arrest. Victorian historians would dramatically suggest she went mad, but at most, it's more likely she suffered a breakdown after the death of Mortimer. She remained at Windsor only until 1332, when she was allowed to move to her own property of Castle Rising in Norfolk. In March of 1332, Queen Philippa gave birth to a daughter who was named Isabella after her grandmother, a conscious effort to rehabilitate Isabella at court. She remained a wealthy woman, with Edward ensuring in 1331 she was given an annual income of £3,000, which had risen to £4,000 by 1337. As per her tastes, Isabella continued to enjoy a lavish lifestyle in her middle age, employing a retinue of entertainers and singers and travelling around Europe. She also gave to religious institutions, in 1347 patronising the convent of the Poor Clares. She was occasionally involved in politics, such as in 1358 when she was part of the peace talks with Charles II of Navarre. Her daughter Joan left her husband David II for his unfaithfulness and their loveless marriage in 1357, no doubt inspired by her mother's bravery in refusing to come home to a husband who did not care for her. She remained with Isabella, nursing her as she grew older. Isabella was very fond of her grandchildren, especially Edward the Black Prince, and she was visited frequently by her family as well as members of the court. As she came to the end of her long life, Isabella took the habit of the Third Order of St. Francis, wearing it beneath her clothes. In July of that year, she fell ill after overdosing on a medicine that had been prescribed to her for another ailment. On the 22nd of August 1358, with her daughter Joan by her side, in her early 60s, Isabella of France died. She was given a magnificent funeral by Edward III, her body buried at Greyfriars Church in Newgate, wrapped in her habit and the cloak she had worn on her wedding day. She was also buried, at her request, with the silver casket containing Edward's heart. Isabella would go down in history as possibly the most hated medieval woman, and as a queen who became a harlot, a she-wolf waiting to pounce on her lawful husband. In reality, the truth is much more complicated. She had started life as a princess groomed to be a queen, certain all kings were like her father, who doted on his wife and ruled with a rod of iron. But when she had arrived to become England's queen, Isabella found herself playing second fiddle to a man, neglected by her husband and pushed aside at every opportunity. But she remained by her husband's side in these early years, supporting him even through his failures, bearing him 4 healthy children and doing her duty as queen. It was only when she was pushed by his new favourite, Hugh Despencer, her children removed and her life reduced to poverty, that Isabella decided to fight back, not so much a she-wolf as a woman with no choice left, just as her contemporaries saw it. Victorian attitudes would have much effect on how her relationship with Roger Mortimer was seen, but through modern eyes, we can understand how a woman starved of love and affection would want a few years of happiness with a caring lover, even if the consequences were dire. She cared deeply for her children, especially her eldest son Edward III, and even in old age, Edward II never left her thoughts. In reality then, Isabella was a kind and intelligent woman, who was also greedy and had expensive tastes. A woman who was willing to put up with a loveless marriage, so long as it was a partnership, who both grew her allies and pushed them away. She was even willing to go against the constraints of her time for women, so long as it served a greater purpose for her son and her own life. In short, Isabella was an ordinary woman pushed to her limits in an extraordinary time, who changed the face of England's politics forever. Blanche of Castile was a powerhouse of the 13th century. While other medieval queens of the time were also noted for taking power in the form of regencies, Blanche did it with such skill and understanding that she secured France's power and stability for decades, and paved the way for her son to become one of the most loved monarchs of the time. This video looks at her journey from a princess with an illustrious ancestry to a queen mother who was the backbone of France's rule. Blanche was born on the 4th of March 1188 in Palencia, Castile, into one of Europe's most illustrious royal families. Her father, King Alfonso VIII of Castile, was a prominent ruler in the Reconquista, the long Christian campaign to claim Iberian territories from Muslim rule. Her mother, Eleanor of England, was the daughter of 2 legendary figures in history, Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Through her mother, Blanche inherited a rich legacy of power and intrigue. Henry II, the founder of the Angevin Empire, was a complex figure known for his legal reforms and relentless ambition. Blanche's grandmother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was one of the most powerful women of the medieval era. Eleanor ruled Aquitaine in her own right, was queen of both France and England, and played a pivotal role in the cultural and political life of 12th century Europe. Blanche's maternal lineage also gave her ties to the Plantagenet dynasty of England, infamous for its fierce rivalry and internal conflicts. These connections would later influence her political alliances and the expectations placed upon her as a queen. In 1199, Eleanor of Aquitaine, then well into her 70s, travelled to Castile to choose a bride for her grandson, Louis, the future Louis VIII of France. Eleanor had 2 granddaughters to choose from, Blanche and her elder sister, Urraca. Despite Urraca's status as the eldest, Eleanor saw something special in the young Blanche. Her decision was likely influenced by Blanche's sharp mind, poise, and potential as a future queen. Not only that, but the match was politically significant. France and England had been locked in a power struggle for decades, and Eleanor sought to strengthen ties between Castile and France to counterbalance English ambitions on the continent. The marriage would solidify an alliance that would benefit both Castile and the Capetian dynasty of France. Blanche married Louis in 1200, likely at the age of 12, in a grand ceremony that symbolised the union of 2 powerful dynasties. As was customary for royal marriages, the union was more political than personal, but Blanche quickly proved herself to be an asset to the French court. She was not content to remain in the background as many queens in waiting were expected to do. Instead, she took an active interest in court politics and governance, earning respect for her intelligence and diplomatic skill. When her husband ascended the throne in 1223 as Louis VIII, Blanche became Queen of France. Although her role was officially as a consort, she proved to be much more than a ceremonial figure. From the outset, Blanche demonstrated her political acumen and ability to navigate the complex dynamics of the French court, which was a court steeped in tradition and factionalism. The French monarchy, though growing in power, still faced challenges from rebellious nobles and external threats, particularly from England. Blanche's ability to navigate these challenges would set the stage for her later role as regent, a role that would define her legacy. Blanche was queen at a pivotal point in history, when a queen was growing from a passive position into a political entity, albeit one who still supported their husband. Her role as Queen of France during Louis's reign was far from passive. Her influence extended beyond the traditional ceremonial duties of a queen consort, as she actively supported her husband in his political, military, and administrative endeavours. Together, they worked to strengthen the French crown's authority in a time of transition and consolidation. This would be shown through one of the major events of Louis's reign, his continuation of the Albigensian Crusade, a campaign to eradicate the Cathar heresy in southern France. This movement, supported by the Catholic Church, sought to bring the Languedoc region under greater royal and religious control. While Louis led military campaigns in the south, Blanche remained in the north, managing affairs in Paris and ensuring the stability of the kingdom. Her ability to maintain order and loyalty among the nobility allowed Louis to focus on his military objectives without fear of unrest at home. Blanche's devout Catholicism aligned with the Church's goals as well, and this meant she also likely played a role in encouraging support for the crusade among influential figures in the north. The campaign helped to extend Capetian control into the south, further centralizing French authority. Although the Cathar movement persisted in some areas, Louis's efforts laid the groundwork for the eventual integration of the Languedoc region into the French crown. Blanche's upbringing in the culturally rich and politically complex courts of Castile and her familial ties to the English Plantagenets made her a skilled diplomat. She played a crucial role in managing alliances and maintaining peace during her husband's reign. France and England were long-standing rivals, and tensions between the two kingdoms continued during Louis's reign. Blanche's ties to the English royal family positioned her as a natural mediator. She helped maintain stability in the north while Louis focused on consolidating power in other regions. On top of this, Blanche's presence at court helped to bolster the image of a united and capable monarchy. She worked alongside Louis to navigate the complex web of feudal loyalties, ensuring that rebellious nobles were kept in check and that royal authority was respected. Blanche's influence even extended to the administrative and financial aspects of Louis's reign. Her sharp mind and practical approach were invaluable as the French crown sought to strengthen its economic base. She was directly involved in managing the royal treasury, ensuring that resources were allocated efficiently for both domestic governance and military campaigns, and she would have also supported her husband's measures to increase royal revenues, such as asserting greater control over taxation and trade. Both Blanche and Louis were patrons of the arts and religious institutions as well. Their reign saw the construction of churches and the promotion of cultural projects that reinforced the monarchy's image as pious and sophisticated. She also owned a large number of books in both French and Latin, and many of these were used to teach her children. At that time, it was the place of royal and noble women to teach their children to read and write. Blanche appears to have also taught her 5 children Latin. During Louis's reign, several notable noble rebellions and regional conflicts challenged the French crown. These revolts primarily stemmed from the tension between the growing power of the Capetian monarchy and the autonomy of feudal lords. Blanche played a significant role in managing these disputes, particularly as Louis focused on military campaigns. In 1224, the Poitou Rebellion kicked off, when Louis launched a campaign to assert control over the region, a strategically significant area in western France that had traditionally been contested between France and England. Many local nobles in Poitou, still loyal to the English crown, resisted Louis's efforts to consolidate Capetian rule. They allied with Hugh X of Lusignan, a powerful lord who had married Isabella of Angoulême, the widow of King John of England. While Louis led military operations in Poitou, Blanche helped manage the court and ensured that the northern regions remained stable, and her diplomatic efforts likely helped secure the loyalty of other nobles, preventing the rebellion from spreading beyond Poitou. There were also constant tensions with the Anglo-Norman nobility of England. After the English King John lost most of his continental possessions, including Normandy, to Louis's father Philip II, many Anglo-Norman lords found themselves under French rule. This transition was rarely smooth, as these lords often felt torn between loyalty to the English and French crowns. During the king's reign, some Anglo-Norman nobles intermittently rebelled, hoping to regain autonomy or even return to English rule. Blanche's unique position as a daughter of Eleanor of England, while also being Queen of France, allowed her to become a mediator between the two sides, maintaining the loyalty of key Anglo-Norman families and allowing the crown to focus its military efforts on other fronts. Blanche also worked to secure the loyalty of Brittany by creating alliances with the nobility there. She also stood out amongst medieval queens for her remarkable blend of intelligence, piety, and unwavering strength of character. These qualities not only defined her tenure as queen consort, but also laid the foundation for her influential regency and the legacy she left behind. Blanche was deeply religious, a trait she inherited from her upbringing in the devoutly Catholic Castilian court. Her faith was not merely personal, but an integral part of her political strategy and public image. She provided patronage to monasteries and churches, furthering the construction of religious buildings and funding ecclesiastical projects. These acts reinforced the monarchy's role as a protector of the faith, and Blanche's personal piety was evident in her disciplined daily prayers and frequent acts of charity. Her visible faith served as an example to her court and the broader French populace. This allowed her to maintain a position of trust and popularity amongst the ordinary French people. Her devoutness also left an indelible mark on her son, Louis IX, who would later be canonized as Saint Louis. Blanche instilled in him a sense of moral responsibility, a commitment to justice, and an unshakable devotion to the church, shaping his reputation as a pious and virtuous king. She was also a loving but firm mother, and her approach to motherhood reflected her keen awareness of the responsibilities that came with raising a future king. She was not only a loving parent, but also a shrewd strategist who carefully guided her children's education and character development. Blanche ensured that the future Louis IX received a rigorous education, encompassing not only governance and diplomacy, but also moral and spiritual values. She surrounded him with tutors and advisors who shared her high standards for virtue and intellectual achievement. Her focus on instilling integrity, discipline, and a sense of duty was apparent in Louis's later actions as king. He embodied many of the principles she emphasized, particularly in his dedication to justice and his role as a crusader. But Blanche was also fiercely protective of her children, ensuring their safety and well-being even in the tumultuous political climate of the time. Through her maternal influence, Blanche not only shaped the life of her son, but also left an enduring legacy on the French monarchy. But in 1226, it marked a watershed moment in Blanche's life when her husband, Louis VIII, died in November of that year. Louis's death occurred in the aftermath of his campaign in southern France, where he sought to consolidate Capetian authority. The harsh conditions of the campaign, combined with the stress of war, weakened him, and he ultimately succumbed to dysentery. Louis's death left France in a precarious position. The Albigensian Crusade had strained resources, and the loyalty of many nobles remained uncertain. The kingdom was entirely vulnerable to internal rebellions and external threats. On top of this, the sudden loss of her husband thrust Blanche into the role of regent, a position that came with immense challenges and opportunities. At 38 years old, Blanche found herself at the centre of a storm. Her eldest son and heir, Louis IX, was only 12 years old, making him too young to rule independently. Of course, Blanche's appointment as regent was not guaranteed, and she faced significant resistance. Blanche had to fight to establish herself as regent. Some nobles, seeing an opportunity to exploit the kingdom's instability, opposed her rule. The most notable opposition came from Pierre Mauclerc, Duke of Brittany, and other powerful lords who sought greater autonomy. Many of the key barons who she needed for support were led by Mauclerc, and they refused to acknowledge the coronation of the young king. Once again, Blanche's quick moves protected her son shortly after the coronation. As Mauclerc and the barons marched, they nearly captured Blanche and young Louis as they travelled south of Paris. Blanche appealed to the citizens of Paris to protect their rightful king, and they lined the roads to protect him. She understood that a show of strength was necessary to maintain the stability of the monarchy and the Capetian hold on France. Therefore, she sought aid from two key allies, Theobald IV of Champagne and Romano Bonaventura. Theobald, known as the Poet Count, was a significant noble whose loyalty Blanche worked tirelessly to secure. As one of France's most powerful lords, Theobald's support was instrumental in rallying other nobles to the royal cause. His resources and military forces were vital in assembling an army capable of countering the rebellion, and the papal legate to France, Romano Bonaventura, represented the authority of the Catholic Church, a critical ally for Blanche. His backing not only legitimized her regency, but also helped sway other nobles to support her. Bonaventura provided financial and logistical assistance, ensuring the army was well equipped and supplied for the campaigns ahead, as well as his influence reinforcing Blanche's pious image, strengthening her position as a moral and capable leader in the eyes of the French populace and clergy. In 1227, the royal army Blanche had gathered successfully marched against rebellious forces in Brittany and Poitou, suppressing uprisings and reaffirming the crown's authority. These victories demonstrated her effectiveness as a military strategist and her ability to command loyalty from her forces. The deployment of this army also sent a clear message to other nobles. The monarchy, under Blanche's regency, was not to be underestimated. Once her regency was confirmed, Blanche immediately set to work stabilizing the kingdom. She managed royal finances, appointed trusted officials, and took steps to quell noble unrest. However, Blanche wouldn't always have such an easy life at court. Her role as a mother and advisor to Louis remained prominent even after he reached maturity and assumed full control of the throne. He didn't withhold anything from Blanche, and no one dared to criticize her, not least because she was often proven right. She also helped arrange his marriage, establishing an alliance with Ramon Berenguer, Count of Provence, which she also hoped would keep Toulouse in check. His eldest daughter, Margaret of Provence, was chosen as Louis's bride, selected by Blanche more for her religious devotion and courtly manner than her beauty, and they were married on the 27th of May 1234. However, Margaret and her mother-in-law didn't actually get along that well. Due to her position as regent, and probably at least partially due to personality, Blanche was highly controlling of her son and the court. Before Margaret and Louis even arrived in Paris after their wedding, Blanche dismissed the family and servants that had come with her new daughter-in-law, likely both to maintain control over Margaret and prevent her family getting a grip on Louis. The Queen Mother's close relationship with Louis led her to view Margaret with suspicion, believing her influence might distract the young king from his duties. And Louis's devotion to his mother further complicated matters. Despite his affection for Margaret, Louis often deferred to Blanche on political and personal matters, creating resentment between the two women. Blanche's dominance in court politics often left little room for Margaret to assert herself. The Queen Mother maintained a firm grip on the royal household and its affairs, a situation that was not unusual for medieval Queen's Dowager, but still would have made Margaret feel marginalised. This rivalry, while rooted in courtly dynamics, also reflected the broader societal expectations of the time, where a Queen Mother's authority often clashed with the desires of a younger queen to take her place as a central figure at court. Blanche continued to wield significant power as Louis reached adulthood, maintaining alliances and stability through her own power, disguised as that of Louis's. In 1239, France was increasingly gripped by a wave of anti-Semitism, fueled by religious tensions and political maneuvering. Jewish communities faced mounting threats, including accusations of heresy and pressure to convert, which culminated in a formal disputation presided over by Blanche herself and King Louis. Louis, known for his fervent piety, advocated strongly for the destruction of Jewish texts, viewing them as heretical and dangerous. His position reflected the dominant attitudes of the time, which sought to suppress perceived threats to the Catholic Church. Despite the prevailing hostility, Blanche demonstrated a more measured approach. She insisted on a fair hearing for the Jewish representatives, emphasizing the need for justice and proper procedure even in such contentious matters. Following the disputation, Louis still ordered the burning of the Talmud and other Jewish texts, a devastating blow to Jewish scholarship in France. However, Blanche took a more protective stance. She personally assured Rabbi Yakil that he and his property would remain under her protection, offering a rare moment of compassion and humanity in a time of widespread persecution. In 1248, Louis embarked on the Seventh Crusade, leaving Blanche once again as regent of France. Despite her advancing age, she proved as capable as ever, managing the kingdom during her son's prolonged absence. Again, it's a role that arguably should have fallen to Margaret, but there was no question of who would actually hold the reins. The Queen Mother wasn't happy with her son going off to the Crusades despite her religious leanings, as she saw France needed stability. However, Blanche's regency during the Crusade was marked by her efforts to maintain stability at home. She faced the challenge of managing a kingdom without its king, while also supporting Louis's crusading efforts abroad. She dealt with rebellions and unrest from nobles just as she had once before, who sought to exploit the king's absence, using her well-honed diplomatic skills, and when necessary, military force to subdue dissent. However, as time went on, Blanche began to drain the treasury and military forces to support her son's efforts, threatening the stability in France that she herself had worked to acquire. But even a feared Queen Mother couldn't live forever, and Blanche's life came to an end in 1252 at the age of 64, while still serving as regent during Louis's absence. Her death marked the conclusion of a remarkable career as one of medieval Europe's most formidable queens. She died at Melun, a site that symbolized her commitment to her son's reign in the Capetian dynasty, passing away in the midst of her duties, highlighting her lifelong dedication to the kingdom and her family. Although Margaret was probably secretly a little pleased that her mother-in-law was no longer around, Blanche had been a force of nature, and her death left a void in the French court. Her absence was keenly felt by Louis, who deeply mourned the loss of his mother and staunchest ally, apparently refusing to speak to anyone for 2 days after being told. Despite how she might have rubbed a few people up the wrong way, Blanche of Castile's contributions to the stability and growth of France cannot be overstated. Her leadership during times of political and social upheaval left a profound and lasting legacy on the French crown and its territories. Blanche's regency during her son Louis IX's minority ensured the continuity of his dynasty during a period when the throne was vulnerable to internal and external threats. Her adept handling of noble rebellions, her strategic alliances, and her control over court politics preserved the kingdom's integrity. And her regency also ensured that Louis inherited a stable, financially secure, and diplomatically strengthened kingdom, allowing him to focus on his ambitious projects and crusades. Blanche's intelligence and resilience earned her respect and admiration among her contemporaries and later historians. She demonstrated that women could wield significant power and govern effectively in a male-dominated society, and her skillful diplomacy and ability to navigate court intrigue set her apart from many other medieval queens, ensuring her influence extended far beyond her immediate family. Blanche of Castile's legacy endures as a testament to her strength, intelligence, and determination. She not only secured the survival of the Capetian dynasty during a critical period, but also helped to shape the future of France as a leading power in medieval Europe. Her impact is reflected in the success of her son Louis IX and the stability of the realm she so skillfully governed. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.